Welcome, dear listener, to a place of magic and memory where the gentle glow of wand light flickers against ancient stone walls and the whispers of destiny drift like autumn leaves through enchanted corridors. Tonight, as you settle into comfort and allow the weight of the day to lift from your shoulders, we invite you on a journey through a life less celebrated, but no less extraordinary. A story of quiet courage that bloomed in the shadows of greatness. This is the tale of Neville Longbottom, a boy who began his journey stumbling over his own feet and ended it standing tall against the darkest wizard the world had ever known. His story is not one of immediate brilliance or natural talent, but rather of something far more precious. The slow, steady growth of a soul that refused to give up, even when the world seemed determined to overlook him. As you listen, let the soft rhythm of these words carry you gently toward rest. There is no urgency here, no need to rush. We have all the time in the world to explore the greenhouse where Neville found his confidence, the corridors of Hogwarts where he discovered his courage, and the moment when a flaming hat revealed the hero he had always been. So breathe deeply, dear listener. Let your mind drift into the wizarding world, where magic is real, and even the most unlikely among us can change the course of history. Tonight, we rest in the knowledge that strength comes not from never falling, but from always rising again. And now, our story truly begins. Chapter 1. Roots in Sorrow. Seeds of Strength. In the ancient and noble lineage of British wizarding families, the name Longbottom had long been spoken with quiet respect. Not as famous as the Potters, perhaps, nor as wealthy as the Malfoys, but steady and true. A family of substance, rooted deep in the magical soil of England, like the very plants they had cultivated for generations. The Longbottoms were known for their loyalty, their service to the Ministry of Magic, and their unwavering commitment to what was right, even when what was right proved dangerous. It was into this legacy that Neville Frank Longbottom was born on the 30th of July in 1980, during those dark and desperate months when the First Wizarding War raged across Britain like a plague. The very air seemed to crackle with fear in those days. Dear listener, wizards and witches disappeared from their homes in the dead of night. The Daily Prophet arrived each morning with fresh reports of tragedy, and through it all, a name was whispered in terror. Lord Voldemort, the Dark Lord who sought to subjugate all of magical Britain beneath his cruel regime. Neville's parents, Frank and Alice Longbottom, were Aurors, those brave witches and wizards who dedicated their lives to hunting down practitioners of the dark arts. But they were more than just Aurors. They were members of the Order of the Phoenix, that secret organization founded by Albus Dumbledore himself to stand against Voldemort when the Ministry proved too frightened or too corrupted to act. Frank Longbottom was a man of quiet strength, with warm eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and a dueling wand that moved faster than summer lightning. Alice was fierce and brilliant, her laughter like silver bells even in the darkest times, her courage absolutely unshakable. They were deeply in love, these two, and when their son arrived in the world during those last days of July, they held him close and whispered promises of protection over his sleeping form. Little did they know, dear listener, that their baby boy had been born at almost the exact moment as another child, in another home not so very far away, a boy named Harry Potter, who would one day become known as the boy who lived. For you see, There was a prophecy, deep within the Department of Mysteries at the Ministry of Magic, locked away in the Hall of Prophecy among thousands of other dusty predictions. There existed a crystal sphere containing words that would shape the fate of two families. The prophecy spoke of a boy born as the 7th month died, born to parents who had thrice defied the Dark Lord, and it declared that this boy would have the power to vanquish Voldemort. But prophecies, dear listener, are strange and slippery things. The prophecy could have meant Harry Potter, or it could have meant Neville Longbottom. Both boys were born at the end of July. Both sets of parents had fought against Voldemort and escaped him 3 times. Either could have been the chosen one. But Voldemort made his choice. He chose to hunt the Potters, and in doing so, he sealed both Harry's fate and Neville's, though in very different ways. The night Voldemort fell, the night Harry Potter became famous throughout the wizarding world, Neville slept peacefully in his cot, unaware that his life had just taken a turn down a different path. He would not be the boy who lived. He would not carry the scar or the weight of prophecy. But fate, dear listener, had not forgotten him. Fate was simply waiting, patient as the turning of seasons, for the right moment to reveal the courage that lived inside young Neville's heart. The months following Voldemort's downfall should have been peaceful ones. The wizarding world celebrated. Witches and wizards emerged from hiding. Magical Britain breathed a collective sigh of relief. But for the Longbottom family, the worst was yet to come. There were Death Eaters, you see, Voldemort's most loyal followers, who refused to believe their master had truly fallen. They were certain he would return, and they were desperate to discover where he had gone, how they might find him, how they might restore him to power. And so they began to hunt those who had fought most effectively against the Dark Lord, seeking information through the most terrible means imaginable. On a cold November night in 1981, when Neville was barely more than a year old, 4 Death Eaters came for his parents. Bellatrix Lestrange, wild-eyed and laughing, mad with devotion to her fallen master. Her husband, Rodolphus, cruel and methodical. Rodolphus's brother Rabistan, whose wand had ended more lives than he could count. And Barty Crouch Jr., the son of a ministry official, twisted by darkness into something monstrous. They found Frank and Alice Longbottom, and they subjected them to the Cruciatus Curse, the torture curse, one of the 3 unforgivable curses, a spell so terrible that its use carries a lifetime sentence in Azkaban prison. The curse sends such extraordinary pain through the victim's body that it feels as though every bone is breaking, every nerve is on fire, every moment is an eternity of suffering. And they didn't stop. They tortured Frank and Alice for information about Voldemort's whereabouts. And when the brave Aurors had no information to give, for how could they know where a vanquished spirit had fled? The Death Eaters simply continued, driven by rage and madness and terrible, dark loyalty. They tortured the Longbottoms beyond the point of begging, beyond the point of screaming, beyond the point where the human mind can endure. They tortured them into insanity. When the Aurors finally arrived and arrested the 4 Death Eaters, they found Frank and Alice Longbottom alive, but destroyed. Their minds had shattered under the sustained torture. They could no longer speak coherently. They could no longer recognize their own son. They had been stolen from themselves, trapped forever in a prison of fractured thoughts and broken memories, conscious but unreachable, lost in a fog that would never lift. Little Neville, just 15 months old, was found by his grandmother, Augusta Longbottom, that formidable witch who arrived at the scene with her lips pressed into a thin line and her vulture-topped hat sitting perfectly straight upon her head, despite the tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She took her grandson into her arms, and she made a silent vow that he would grow up knowing he was loved, knowing he came from strength, knowing that his parents had been heroes. But how do you explain such things to a child too young to understand, dear listener? How do you tell a boy that his parents still live, but can never truly be with him again? Augusta Longbottom did her best, raising young Neville in the family home, a comfortable, if somewhat old-fashioned dwelling, filled with the accumulated possessions of generations of Longbottoms. The house was full of magical plants in every windowsill, portraits of stern ancestors on every wall, and the lingering presence of absence. 2 empty chairs at the dinner table, 2 voices that would never again fill the rooms with laughter. Frank and Alice were transferred to St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies and injuries, to the 4th floor, the locked ward for permanent spell damage. They would live there for the rest of their lives, cared for by healers, but never healing, forever suspended in that terrible space between life and death where the Cruciatus curse had left them. And so Neville grew up visiting his parents in that sad, quiet ward, bringing them sweets they couldn't really appreciate and talking to them about his life while they stared at nothing or offered him candy wrappers as gifts, the only gesture they could still manage. His mother Alice would sometimes press a crumpled Drubel's best-blowing gum wrapper into his hand, and Neville would take it solemnly, treasuring these meaningless gifts because they were all she could give him. Augusta raised her grandson with love, yes, but also with exacting standards. She had lost her son to darkness, and she was determined that her grandson would live up to the Longbottom name, would prove himself worthy of his brave parents, would show the world that he carried their courage in his veins. But dear listener, sometimes the weight of such expectations can be heavier than any trunk, more crushing than any curse. Young Neville tried so hard to please his grandmother. He tried to show the signs of magical talent she was watching for so anxiously. But magic, particularly in childhood, is an unpredictable thing, as wild and untamable as the wind. Some children send sparks flying from their fingertips before they can walk. Others turn their teacher's hair blue when angered. But Neville's magic seemed hesitant to show itself at all. His great-uncle Algy was particularly concerned about this apparent lack of magical ability. On more than one occasion, Uncle Algy took it upon himself to try to startle the magic out of young Neville through increasingly dangerous means. He would dangle the boy out of upstairs windows by his ankles or push him off the end of Blackpool Pier, all while insisting it was for Neville's own good that fear would unlock the power hiding inside him. These were terrifying experiences for a small child, dear listener, and they did nothing to help Neville's confidence. Instead, they taught him that the world was a frightening place where even family members might hurt you in the name of helping you, where your own inadequacy might lead people to dangle you by your feet over hard cobblestones, while gulls cried overhead and waves crashed below. But magic, when it finally came, arrived in an unexpected way, as magic so often does. Neville was 8 years old, visiting his great-uncle Algy for tea, trying to be as small and unnoticed as possible to avoid another magical encouragement session. The adults were talking in the parlour, and Neville was perched uncomfortably on a chair, trying desperately not to spill his pumpkin juice, or drop his biscuit, or do anything that might draw attention to himself. And then Uncle Algy, in a moment of what he presumably thought was playful encouragement, offered the boy a meringue. And then, when Neville reached for it, purposefully, let him begin to tumble backward out the window. Perhaps Uncle Algy expected to catch him at the last moment. Perhaps he thought Neville would instinctively grab hold of something. But Neville fell, tumbled through the open window of the second-story room, the ground rushing up to meet him, hard and unforgiving. And then, oh dear listener, and then, something inside Neville simply refused to let him fall. His magic, silent for so long, suddenly burst forth in a desperate act of self-preservation. He bounced, like a rubber ball, like a bubble, like something utterly impossible and completely magical. Young Neville bounced right across the garden, over the hedge, and landed safely on the road beyond, completely unharmed. The family was delighted. His grandmother wept with relief and joy. Uncle Algy was so proud. He bought Neville his very own toad, a gift that Neville received with mixed feelings. For though he was grateful to finally be accepted as a proper wizard, he couldn't help but wish his magic had announced itself in a less terrifying fashion. The toad was named Trevor, and it would become Neville's constant companion through his childhood years and into his time at Hogwarts, though Trevor had a terrible habit of escaping and needing to be found, a tendency that would come to symbolize something important about Neville himself, the way things that seem lost can still be recovered, the way patience and persistence matter more than natural talent. And so, Neville Longbottom grew into boyhood, a round-faced child with uncertain eyes and gentle hands, raised by a grandmother who loved him but constantly reminded him of the legacy he had to uphold. He was taught that his parents were heroes, that they had sacrificed everything for the greater good, that their courage had been absolute and their loyalty unbreakable. These were heavy truths for a child to carry, especially when that child struggled to remember simple spells, frequently lost his toad, and jumped at loud noises. But there was something growing in Neville during those early years, dear listener, though no one, including Neville himself, quite recognized it yet. It was there in the way he kept searching for Trevor, no matter how many times the toad escaped. It was there in the way he continued to visit his parents at St. Mungo's, even though those visits broke his heart every single time. It was there in the patient way he tended to the magical plants that filled his grandmother's home, learning their needs, understanding their natures, giving them the gentle care they required to thrive. Courage, you see, doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. Sometimes it grows quietly, like a seed in dark soil, sending down roots that go deeper than anyone can see, building a foundation of strength that will, in time, support the most remarkable growth. The letter from Hogwarts arrived on Neville's 11th birthday, delivered by a magnificent owl that landed on the breakfast table and scattered toast crumbs everywhere. Gusta Longbottom opened the envelope with trembling hands, relief washing over her face as she read the words, confirming what the bouncing incident had proven years earlier. Neville Frank Longbottom was indeed a wizard, and he was cordially invited to attend Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. They went to Diagon Alley to purchase his school supplies, a bewildering, wonderful adventure through shops filled with cauldrons and spellbooks, owls and wands, robes and pointed hats. Neville tried his best to remember everything on the list, but the magical shopping district was so overwhelming, so filled with sights and sounds and possibilities, that he found himself constantly distracted and frequently confused. But there was one moment, dear listener, one quiet moment in Ollivander's wand shop that stayed with Neville forever. He had expected to try various wands until one chose him, as was the custom. But his grandmother had other ideas. She presented him with his father's wand, the wand that Frank Longbottom had used throughout his career as an aura, the wand that had cast protective charms and powerful spells, the wand of a hero. "Your father won't be needing it anymore," Augusta said, her voice careful and controlled. "And it's only right that you should have it." Mr. Ollivander examined the wand, 13 inches, cherry wood with a core of unicorn hair, and his pale eyes flickered with something that might have been concern. "The wand chooses the wizard, Madame Longbottom," he said softly. "It's not always advisable, but Augusta would hear none of it. This was Frank's wand, and Neville would carry it as a reminder of his father's courage, as an inspiration to be worthy of the Longbottom name." And so, Neville left Ollivander's, not with a wand that had chosen him, but with a wand that carried the weight of his father's legacy and the pressure of his grandmother's expectations. It was a beautiful wand, powerful and well made, but it had been crafted for Frank Longbottom's magic, attuned to Frank Longbottom's essence. For Neville, using it would always be like trying to wear shoes that didn't quite fit. Functional, perhaps, but never entirely comfortable, never quite right. But Neville didn't complain. He never did. He simply tucked the wand into his pocket, collected Trevor from where the toad had hopped under a display of brass scales, and followed his grandmother back out into the bright sunshine of Diagon Alley, trying to ignore the nervous flutter in his stomach when he thought about the approaching school year. Hogwarts, the finest school of witchcraft and wizardry in Britain, possibly in the world. A castle filled with ghosts and moving staircases, talking portraits and hidden passages. A place where he would learn to transform objects and brew potions, where he would fly on broomsticks and duel with wands, where he would, hopefully, prove himself worthy of his family name. Or, Neville thought, with a sinking feeling he tried desperately to ignore, a place where he would fail spectacularly in front of hundreds of witches and wizards his own age, confirming what his Uncle Algy had always suspected, that the magic had only barely taken hold, that he was the weakest link in a family chain of courage and power. As the summer days shortened and September first drew closer, Neville practiced with his father's wand in the garden, trying to master even the simplest spells from his new textbooks. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. Trevor watched from a nearby lily pad, occasionally offering a sympathetic croak, and the magical plants swayed gently in the breeze, and overhead the stars wheeled slowly in their ancient patterns, unconcerned with the worries of one anxious 11-year-old boy who had no idea that his story was only just beginning. The 1st of September dawned bright and clear over the Longbottom family home, and Neville woke with his stomach performing what felt like acrobatic flips. Today was the day. Today he would board the Hogwarts Express at King's Cross Station, platform 9 3/4, a platform hidden from Muggle eyes, accessible only by walking straight through what appeared to be a solid brick barrier between platforms 9 and 10. His grandmother had explained this several times, but the thought of running at a wall still made Neville deeply nervous. What if he got it wrong? What if he bounced off the barrier and fell flat on his back in front of everyone? What if his magic chose that precise moment to fail him again? But there was no time for such worries now, dear listener. Augusta Longbottom was already calling from downstairs, her voice sharp with purpose, reminding him that they mustn't be late, that arriving late would be a poor start indeed for a Longbottom at Hogwarts. Neville scrambled to dress in his new robes, still stiff and unfamiliar, and hurried to collect Trevor, who had, of course, escaped from his tank during the night and was discovered finally behind the bathroom radiator, looking remarkably pleased with himself. The journey to King's Cross was a blur of anxiety and anticipation. His grandmother offered last-minute instructions about keeping up with his studies, not disgracing the family name, and remembering to write every week. She pressed a package of his favorite treacle tart into his hands, squeezed his shoulder with surprising gentleness, and then, before he quite knew what was happening, Neville found himself running toward the barrier, his trolley rattling before him, his eyes squeezed shut, his heart in his throat. And then he was through, emerging onto platform 9 3/4 in a cloud of steam and noise and magic. The Hogwarts Express stood gleaming and scarlet before him, its engine hissing softly as families said their goodbyes all along the platform. Neville stood still for a moment, simply taking it in. The magnificent train, the owls hooting from their cages, the cats weaving between luggage, the excited chatter of students greeting friends they hadn't seen all summer. He loaded his trunk onto the train with the help of a kind porter, made certain Trevor was secure in his carrying case, though the Toad's history suggested this optimism was likely misplaced, and climbed aboard, searching for an empty compartment where he might sit quietly and try to calm his racing heart. The train journey north was long and winding, dear listener, carrying the students away from London and deeper into the Scottish Highlands, where Hogwarts made its home. Neville found a compartment and sat by the window watching the countryside roll past, trying not to think about all the ways he might embarrass himself in the coming days. Other students passed by in the corridor, laughing and talking, clearly comfortable in this magical world in ways that Neville couldn't quite imagine feeling himself. And then, of course, Trevor escaped. Neville discovered the empty case with a sinking heart and immediately set out to search the train, opening compartment doors and stammering apologies, asking if anyone had seen a toad, growing more flustered with each negative response. It was in one such compartment that he encountered a bossy-looking girl with bushy brown hair who informed him briskly that she hadn't seen a toad, but she'd certainly help him look. And wasn't he lucky that she'd already memorized several useful spells from the course books? Her name was Hermione Granger, and she swept out of the compartment with such confidence that Neville found himself following in her wake like a small boat behind a very determined ship. They searched several more compartments together before Hermione suddenly stopped, announced that she needed to help some boy named Harry Potter with a spell. and disappeared, leaving Neville to continue his search alone. He found Trevor eventually. The toad was discovered by another student and returned to Neville with a sympathetic smile. By then, the train was slowing, the announcement echoing through the carriages that they would be arriving at Hogwarts shortly, and students should change into their robes. Neville did so hastily, his fingers fumbling with unfamiliar fastenings. And then the train was stopping, and everyone was disembarking, and there was a giant of a man calling for first years to follow him. First years over here. The man's name was Hagrid, and he was the keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts, a huge, wild-haired, kind-eyed man who led them down a steep, narrow path in the darkness. Neville slipped twice on the damp stones, catching himself both times with his hands, feeling his cheeks burn with embarrassment, even though several other students had stumbled as well. And then they rounded a bend, and there it was, Hogwarts Castle. Oh, dear listener, if you could have seen it as Neville saw it that first time, perched atop a high mountain across a vast black lake, its many windows glittering like stars against the night sky, its towers reaching up toward the moon, its ancient stones humming with centuries of magic. It was the most beautiful thing Neville had ever seen, terrifying and wonderful in equal measure, a castle from fairy tales and dreams, and he was actually going to live there. They crossed the lake in small boats that moved by magic, 4 students to a boat, gliding across water so dark and smooth, it looked like polished obsidian. Neville sat very still, afraid that any movement might tip them over, and stared up at the castle growing larger and larger as they approached, its reflection shimmering in the lake beneath them. The boats carried them through a curtain of ivy that hid a wide opening in the cliff face into a dark tunnel that seemed to lead right underneath the castle, until they reached a kind of underground harbor where they clambered out onto rocks and pebbles, then up a flight of stone steps, and finally, to a pair of enormous oak doors and into the castle itself. Professor Minerva McGonagall was waiting for them in the entrance hall, tall and stern in her emerald robes, her black hair pulled back severely, her expression suggesting that she suffered no foolishness whatsoever. She explained the 4 houses, Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin, and told them that they would shortly be sorted, that their house would be like their family while at Hogwarts, that their triumphs would earn points, and their rule-breaking would lose them. Neville's hands were sweating. He wiped them on his robes, the sorting hat. He'd heard about it, of course. Everyone had. But what if it couldn't sort him at all? What if he sat there with a hat on his head and nothing happened because his magic was too weak to register? They were led into the great hall. And oh, what a hall it was, dear listener. 4 long tables filled with students, thousands of candles floating in midair, a ceiling bewitched to look like the night sky outside, stars twinkling overhead, as though the roof had simply disappeared and left them dining under the heavens themselves. The first years walked up the centre aisle, all eyes upon them, and Neville tried desperately to make himself smaller, less noticeable, invisible if possible. Professor McGonagall placed a 4-legged stool before them, and upon it a patched and frayed and very old wizard's hat. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a rip near the brim opened like a mouth, and the hat began to sing. A song about the 4 founders of Hogwarts, about the qualities each house valued, about belonging and choice and destiny. When the song ended, Professor McGonagall began to call names from a long scroll of parchment. Each student would sit on the stool, have the hat placed upon their head, and wait while it deliberated, sometimes quickly, sometimes for longer moments, before shouting out the house name for all to hear. Abbott, Hannah, Hufflepuff. The Hufflepuff table erupted in cheers. Hannah hurried over to join them, pink-faced with pleasure. Bones, Susan, Hufflepuff. One by one, the first years were sorted. Hermione Granger, the bossy girl from the train, became a Gryffindor. A boy named Draco Malfoy, who Neville recognized from Madame Malkin's robe shop and hadn't much liked, was sorted into Slytherin before the hat even touched his head. Neville watched each sorting with growing dread, his turn creeping closer with alphabetical inevitability. And then, Longbottom, Neville. His legs felt like water as he stumbled forward. Someone whispered something. He couldn't hear what. And there was a scatter of laughter. His face burning, Neville sat on the stool, and Professor McGonagall lowered the sorting hat onto his head. It fell down over his eyes, blocking out the great hall, the watching faces, everything except the darkness and a small voice that spoke directly into his ear. "Difficult," murmured the hat. "Very difficult. Plenty of courage, I see. Oh yes, quite a lot of that. Buried deep, but definitely there. Loyal too, hard-working, patient. You'd do well in Hufflepuff, I think. Or perhaps Ravenclaw. There's a mind in here that thinks more carefully than you give yourself credit for." Neville's heart was hammering. Not Slytherin, he thought desperately. Please not Slytherin. Not Slytherin, eh? Said the hat thoughtfully. Are you sure? You could be cunning when you need to be. But no, I see where you belong. I see your parents' courage living on in you, though you don't recognize it yet. Yes, there's only one place for you, Gryffindor. The last word echoed through the great hall, and the Gryffindor table exploded with applause. Neville pulled off the hat with shaking hands, hardly able to believe it. Gryffindor, his parents' house, the house of the brave. Surely there must be some mistake, but there was Professor McGonagall nodding at him to join his new house, and there were the Gryffindor students cheering, and Neville hurried to the table, still dazed, and sat down next to a grinning boy with freckles, who introduced himself as Ron Weasley. The rest of the sorting passed in a blur. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, was sorted into Gryffindor as well, which caused even more excitement. By the time the last student had been sorted, Neville's head was spinning with names and faces, and then Albus Dumbledore stood to speak, and Neville found himself staring at the legendary headmaster with something like awe. Dumbledore welcomed them all, said a few words that seemed simultaneously silly and profound. Nitwit, blubber, oddment, tweak. And then the feast began. The golden plates filled with food, more food than Neville had ever seen in one place. And despite his nerves, he found himself eating hungrily, laughing at the jokes of the Gryffindor ghosts, listening to the older students' stories about Hogwarts, just beginning, to feel like maybe, possibly, he might actually belong here. After the feast, the first years followed a prefect named Percy Weasley through the castle's winding corridors, up moving staircases that shifted beneath their feet, past portraits whose occupants moved between frames and called out greetings or insults depending on their mood. Neville tried desperately to memorize the route, but there were so many turns, so many corridors that looked identical, So many doors and tapestries and suits of armor that he just knew he was going to get hopelessly lost. The Gryffindor common room was reached through a portrait of a very fat lady in a pink silk dress. "Password?" she asked, and Percy said, "Caput Draconis," and the portrait swung forward to reveal a round hole in the wall. They climbed through into the common room beyond, a cozy circular room full of squashy armchairs, tables for studying, and a crackling fire that filled the space with a warmth and golden light. The boys' dormitories were reached by a spiral staircase. Neville found himself sharing with Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, Dean Thomas, and Seamus Finnegan, all of whom seemed far more confident and comfortable than Neville felt. Their trunks had been brought up already, and there were four four-poster beds, hung with deep red velvet curtains. That first night, Neville lay in his bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the castle, the wind howling outside, the distant hoot of owls, the soft breathing of his roommates, and tried to absorb everything that had happened. He was here. He was actually here, at Hogwarts, sorted into Gryffindor, his parents' house. His grandmother would be so pleased. But beneath the relief and the cautious happiness, there was worry too, because now came the hard part. Now he actually had to do magic, learn spells, attend lessons with a wand that didn't quite work properly for him, and a mind that seemed to forget things at the worst possible moments. The first days of classes confirmed Neville's worst fears, dear listener. He struggled in nearly every subject. In Transfiguration, while other students managed to turn matches into needles with varying degrees of success, Neville's match remained stubbornly match-like, occasionally releasing a puff of smoke, but transforming into nothing at all. Professor McGonagall's lips would thin with disappointment, and she would demonstrate again, her movements precise and patient. But somehow, when Neville tried to replicate them, nothing happened. Charms was hardly better. Professor Flitwick was kind and encouraging, standing on a pile of books to see over his desk, squeaking with delight whenever a student successfully performed a spell. But Neville's feather wouldn't levitate during the levitation charm lesson. It just lay on the desk, occasionally trembling as though considering flight, but never quite achieving it. While Hermione Granger's feather soared to the ceiling on her first try, and even Ron Weasley managed to make his wobble into the air eventually, Neville's remained earthbound, a small monument to his inadequacy. But it was potions class, dear listener, that became Neville's own personal nightmare. Professor Severus Snape swept into the dungeon classroom on their first day like a malevolent bat, his black robes billowing behind him, his dark eyes glittering with what looked unsettlingly like contempt. He spoke in a silky, dangerous voice about the subtle science and exact art of potion making, about simmering cauldrons and bubbling potions, about bottling fame and brewing glory, and putting a stopper in death. Then he began to question Harry Potter with questions clearly designed to humiliate. What would you get if you added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? Where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar? And though Hermione's hand shot into the air with each question, Snape ignored her completely, his attention fixed on Harry with an intensity that seemed deeply personal and utterly unfair. Finally, he set them to brewing a simple potion to cure boils. Neville was partnered with a quiet boy named Seamus, and together they set about chopping and measuring and adding ingredients according to the instructions on the blackboard. But Neville's hands were shaking so badly that he could barely hold his knife properly, and his measurements were slightly off. And when he accidentally added the porcupine quills before taking the cauldron off the fire, he was certain the instructions said to do it that way, but apparently he'd misread them. The potion exploded. It splashed all over Neville and Seamus, raising angry red boils on their skin, and melted Seamus's cauldron into a twisted blob of metal. The class erupted into chaos, students leaping back from the spreading puddle of ruined potion. And Snape was there instantly, his face twisted with fury. "Idiot boy," he snarled, vanishing the spilled potion with a wave of his wand. "I suppose you added the porcupine quills before taking the cauldron off the fire?" Neville whimpered something that might have been an apology, his arms now covered in boils that throbbed painfully. "Take him to the hospital wing," Snape snapped at Seamus, and then he rounded on the rest of the class. "You should have added the quills one at a time. It's in the instructions. Longbottom has lost Gryffindor 5 points for his incompetence." Neville stumbled from the classroom, tears of shame pricking his eyes, his skin burning, his heart heavy with a certain knowledge that he had just confirmed exactly what Snape clearly already believed, that he was hopeless, stupid, utterly useless at magic. From that day forward, potions became a weekly torture. Snape seemed to take particular pleasure in criticizing Neville's work, hovering over his cauldron like a vulture, pointing out every mistake with cutting remarks that made Neville's hands shake worse and his mind go blank. The more nervous Neville became, the more mistakes he made, and the more mistakes he made, the more vicious Snape's comments became. A terrible cycle that left Neville dreading Thursdays with a sick feeling in his stomach. And yet, dear listener, there was one class where something different happened. One place where Neville felt his hands grow steady and his mind grow clear. One subject where he didn't feel like a failure at all. Herbology. The herbology greenhouses were located on the castle grounds, reached by walking across the lawns in the fresh air. And the moment Neville stepped into Greenhouse 1 for his first lesson, something inside him relaxed. The warm, humid air smelled of earth and growing things. Plants filled every available surface. Strange magical plants, some with teeth, some that sang quietly, some that writhed gently in their pots as though dancing to music only they could hear. Professor Pomona Sprout was a squat little witch with flyaway grey hair, a patched hat, and dirt permanently under her fingernails. She was cheerful and knowledgeable, and she spoke about plants with such affection that Neville found himself leaning forward to catch every word. She taught them about Devil's Snare, that first lesson, a plant that would strangle anyone who touched it, but could be defeated with light and warmth. She showed them how to handle various magical fungi, how to prune flutterby bushes, how to recognize the difference between poisonous and non-poisonous toadstools. And Neville discovered, to his own quiet amazement, that he already knew some of this. His grandmother's house had been full of magical plants, and he'd absorbed more than he realized simply by being around them, tending them, watching them grow. When Professor Sprout asked questions, Neville found himself raising his hand, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, as he realized he actually knew the answers. When they were set to repotting bouncing bulbs, Neville's plants bounced with perfect vigor, their roots healthy and their leaves green, while other students struggled with bulbs that wouldn't bounce at all, or bounced so hard they cracked the greenhouse glass. "Excellent work, Longbottom." Professor Sprout beamed at him, and Neville felt something warm bloom in his chest. Praise, genuine praise, not the polite acknowledgement his grandmother gave when he managed not to disappoint her, but real recognition that he had done something well. Herbology became Neville's refuge, dear listener. Those hours in the greenhouse were the only time he felt truly competent, truly at ease. He began arriving early to lessons, offering to help Professor Sprout with extra tasks, learning the names and properties of plants far beyond what was required for first-year students. He would run his hands through the soil, breathe in the green scent of growing things, and feel something very like happiness. The rest of his lessons, however, remained a struggle. Flying class was a disaster. His broomstick seemed to sense his nervousness and refused to obey simple commands. During their very first lesson, when Madame Hooch told them to kick off from the ground for a hover, Neville rose far too quickly, panic flooding through him, and then fell, landing hard and breaking his wrist. He was whisked off to the hospital wing while the lesson continued without him, missing what turned out to be quite an eventful class involving Harry Potter catching a remembrall in midair and somehow getting onto the Gryffindor Quidditch team as a result. History of magic was taught by a ghost, Professor Binns, who droned on in such a monotonous voice that everyone, even Hermione, struggled to stay awake. Defense against the dark arts was taught by Professor Quirrell, a nervous, stuttering man who always smelled faintly of garlic and jumped at sudden movements. Neville found him oddly sympathetic. Here was a teacher who also seemed frightened of the world, though what exactly Quirrell feared, Neville couldn't say. As the weeks passed and autumn deepened into winter, Neville found his place in the rhythms of Hogwarts life. He learned to navigate the moving staircases, though he still got lost regularly and once spent an entire morning trapped behind a suit of armor on the 4th floor until someone heard his calls for help. He learned which portraits were friendly and which would insult you as you passed. He learned that Peeves the poltergeist should be avoided at all costs, especially when carrying anything fragile or valuable. He made friends, tentatively. Harry Potter was kind to him, which Neville found both comforting and slightly overwhelming. How could the famous Harry Potter, the boy who lived, possibly want to be friends with someone like Neville? Ron Weasley treated him with casual friendliness, the easy acceptance of someone who had never doubted his own place in the world. Hermione helped him with homework, though her manner was often more bossy than patient. And Dean and Seamus included him in their dormitory conversations without making him feel like an outsider. But Neville never quite shed the feeling that he was somehow less than the others, that he was the weak link in Gryffindor, the one who would let everyone down. He lost things constantly, his books, his quills, Trevor most of all. He melted his 6th cauldron in potions and received a howler from his grandmother after he'd somehow sent her a letter suggesting he might be moved to Hufflepuff, which had actually been a joke from Ron, but which his grandmother had taken in deadly earnest. The howler arrived during breakfast, a red envelope that smoked at the corners. Neville opened it with shaking hands, and his grandmother's voice erupted from it, magically magnified to boom across the great hall. "Neville Longbottom, how dare you suggest you might leave Gryffindor? Your parents were Gryffindors. I was a Gryffindor, and you will remain a Gryffindor if I have anything to say about it. Stop being ridiculous and apply yourself." The entire hall heard every word. Neville wanted to sink through the floor and disappear forever. Even the Slytherins stopped eating to stare. But Harry reached over and squeezed his shoulder, and Hermione loudly declared that howlers were absolutely medieval and completely inappropriate. And gradually, the moment passed, though Neville's face remained scarlet for the rest of the day. And yet, despite everything, despite the struggles and the embarrassments and the constant feeling of inadequacy, there was something growing in Neville that first year at Hogwarts. It was there in the way he kept trying, even when he failed. It was there in the way he searched patiently for Trevor, night after night, never giving up. It was there in the way his plants flourished under his care in the greenhouse, responding to his gentle attention with vigorous growth. It was the beginning of something, dear listener, though Neville didn't recognize it yet. The first tender shoot of the courage that would, in time, grow into something magnificent. But for now, he was simply a round-faced first-year boy who struggled with magic and loved plants and tried his best not to disappoint the memory of parents who could no longer know him. And as winter settled over Hogwarts, covering the grounds in snow and filling the castle with the warm sense of the approaching Christmas season, Neville Longbottom continued his quiet journey, learning and growing, and slowly, beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, he belonged at Hogwarts after all. The years passed at Hogwarts with the strange quality that time has when one is young, dear listener, simultaneously crawling and rushing, each day feeling eternal, while entire terms seemed to vanish like morning mist. Neville Longbottom grew taller, though he remained round-faced and gentle-eyed, and with each passing year, something within him grew as well, though it grew so slowly that neither he nor anyone else quite noticed it happening. His second year brought the terror of the Chamber of Secrets, when students were being petrified by some unknown monster lurking in the castle's hidden depths. Neville walked the corridors with the same fear as everyone else, jumping at shadows, wondering if he might be next. But the danger, when it came, passed him by, and he spent most of that year continuing his quiet struggles with lessons and his growing mastery of magical plants. Third year brought the Dementors to Hogwarts, those terrible creatures that guarded Azkaban prison, floating spectres that fed on happiness and left only despair in their wake. When a Dementor came near Neville, when he felt its presence even from a distance, the memories it drew to the surface were not his own, but rather the stories he'd been told. His mother's screams under the Cruciatus curse, his father's anguished face, the laughter of Bellatrix Lestrange as she tortured them into madness. These were not memories, but imaginings, yet they felt real enough to leave Neville shaking and sick, stumbling away to quiet corners where he could breathe again and remind himself that he was safe, that Hogwarts was protected, that the past could not reach him here. But it was fourth year, dear listener, when something began to shift in earnest. Fourth year, when the Triwizard Tournament came to Hogwarts, when the castle filled with students from Beauxbaton and Durmstrang, when everything seemed charged with excitement and danger and possibility. Neville was 14 now, caught in that awkward space between childhood and whatever came next. His voice had deepened, though it still cracked at unfortunate moments. He'd finally started growing into his frame, though he remained somewhat stocky and clumsy. He still lost Trevor regularly. The toad had become something of a Gryffindor mascot at this point. Everyone knew to return him when found, and he still struggled in most of his classes, though his herbology skills had become so advanced that Professor Sprout occasionally asked him to demonstrate techniques to the other students. The Yule Ball arrived as part of the tournament festivities, and Neville found himself facing a challenge more terrifying than any three-headed dog or Hungarian horntail. He needed to find a date. The very thought made his palms sweat. Who would possibly want to go with him? He was Neville Longbottom, the boy who melted cauldrons and forgot the password to Gryffindor Tower at least once a week. He worked up the courage to ask Hermione, but she gently explained that she was already going with someone else. Victor Crumb, as it turned out, which seemed utterly impossible until Neville saw them together and realized that Hermione, bossy, bookish Hermione, had somehow become quite pretty when one actually looked at her. In the end, Neville asked Ginny Weasley, who accepted with a kind smile that made it clear she was doing him a favor, as her first choice had already asked someone else. They attended the ball together, both of them awkward in their dress robes. Neville's were ancient and a rather moth-eaten, borrowed from some distant relative, and they danced stiffly while trying not to step on each other's feet. But there was a moment, dear listener, one small moment during that evening when Neville forgot to be self-conscious. The Weird Sisters were playing something slow and sweet, and he and Ginny were swaying more than actually dancing, and she said something that made him laugh, really laugh, and for just those few seconds, he felt almost normal, almost like a regular teenager at a dance, rather than the anxious boy who carried his parents' broken legacy like a weight around his neck. The tournament itself culminated in tragedy: Cedric Diggory's death, Voldemort's return, and the wizarding world was plunged once more into fear. But the Ministry of Magic refused to believe it, refused to accept that the Dark Lord had returned, and so began a year of denial and deliberate blindness that would have terrible consequences. Fifth year arrived, and with it came Dolores Umbridge. Professor Umbridge, though she was no professor in any real sense, was a squat woman who wore entirely too much pink and spoke in a breathy, girlish voice that masked iron cruelty. She had been appointed by the Ministry to teach defense against the dark arts, but her true purpose was to suppress any talk of Voldemort's return, to undermine Dumbledore, and to impose the Ministry's control over Hogwarts. Her first lesson made her philosophy abundantly clear. They would not be practicing defensive spells. They would not be learning how to protect themselves. They would simply be reading about theory, as if knowing the theoretical principles of shield charms would somehow save them when Death Eaters came calling. Hermione's hand shot up immediately, of course, challenging this approach, and Umbridge's sweet smile never wavered as she essentially told Hermione that the Ministry knew best and students should simply do as they were told. When Harry argued that they needed practical experience, that Voldemort had returned and they needed to defend themselves, Umbridge gave him detention, the first of many that would leave scars on the back of his hand, carved there by a cursed quill that wrote in his own blood. Neville sat through these lessons, feeling a growing sense of frustration and helplessness. Here they were, with danger returning to the wizarding world, and they were being prevented from learning the very skills they might need to survive. It was maddening. It was wrong. And then Hermione had an idea. If Umbridge wouldn't teach them properly, they would teach themselves. They would form a secret group, and Harry would lead it, teaching them the defensive spells and practical magic they needed to know. They would meet in secret, practice in hidden places, and prepare themselves for whatever was coming. The group became known as Dumbledore's Army, or the DA for short, and when Hermione asked Neville if he wanted to join, he said yes without hesitation. For perhaps the first time in his life, dear listener, Neville actively chose to step toward danger rather than away from it. He chose to learn, to fight, to prepare himself for a war he knew was coming. They met in the Room of Requirement, a magical room that appeared only when someone truly needed it, transforming itself to suit the purpose required. For the DA, it became a spacious chamber filled with spellbooks, cushions for practice, and dark detectors on the walls. Here, away from Umbridge's watchful eye, they learned. Harry taught them the disarming charm, the stunning spell, the shield charm. He showed them how to produce a corporeal Patronus, that most difficult of spells that could drive away Dementors. He was patient and encouraging in ways that their actual professors sometimes weren't, and Neville found himself actually improving. Not quickly, mind you, not dramatically. Neville's progress was measured in small increments, tiny victories that others might not even notice. His disarming charm worked about half the time. His stunning spell sometimes actually stunned. His shield charm flickered into existence for a few seconds before failing, but he kept coming back. Week after week, he practiced. When his spells failed, he tried again. When other students paired up and he was left without a partner, Harry would work with him personally, never showing impatience, always offering encouragement. That was better, Neville. Try angling your wand a bit more. There. See? You've got it. And slowly, gradually, Neville began to feel something he'd rarely experienced before. Competence. Not mastery, not excellence, but the simple sense that he was capable of learning, of improving, of becoming stronger than he had been. There was one particular lesson, dear listener, that stayed with Neville. Harry was teaching them about the Cruciatus Curse. Not how to perform it, of course, that was illegal and evil, but how to resist it, how to keep one's mind strong against torture. The very topic made Neville feel sick. This was the curse that had destroyed his parents, that had stolen them from him before he was old enough to remember them properly. Harry spoke carefully about the importance of mental strength, of holding on to something good even in the face of pain. And Neville listened, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight, and he thought about his mother's empty eyes when he visited St. Mungo's, about his father who no longer knew he had a son, about Bellatrix Lestrange who had laughed while she broke them. After the lesson, Harry found Neville sitting alone in a corner of the Room of Requirement, staring at nothing. Neville, Harry's voice was gentle. Are you all right? Neville looked up, and for a moment, he considered lying, considered saying he was fine, that everything was okay. But something in Harry's expression, understanding, compassion, shared pain, made him tell the truth instead. That curse, Neville said quietly. The Cruciatus Curse. That's what they used on my parents. Bellatrix Lestrange and the others. They tortured them until... until they couldn't even recognize me anymore. Harry sat down beside him, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They both carried scars from Voldemort's first rise to power. Harry had lost his parents to death. Neville had lost his to something arguably worse. They both knew what it meant to be shaped by loss, to carry grief like a second skin. "I'm sorry, Neville," Harry said finally. "I didn't know. I should have." "No," Neville interrupted. "You couldn't have known. I don't talk about it much. Gran says I should be proud, that they were heroes, that they fought for what was right. And I am proud, but I'm also just angry and sad, and I want to make sure that what happened to them doesn't happen to anyone else." Harry nodded slowly. "Then we keep learning. We keep practicing. We make sure we're ready." "Ready for what?" "For whatever comes next." And Neville understood. The DA wasn't just about passing their defense against the dark arts OWLs. It wasn't about getting around Umbridge's useless lessons. It was about preparing for war, because war was coming, whether the Ministry wanted to admit it or not. The year continued its tumultuous course. Umbridge discovered the DA, and there were interrogations and punishments, and a horrible period where she actually became headmistress when Dumbledore was forced to flee. But through it all, Neville kept practicing, kept learning, kept growing stronger in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with the steel developing in his spine. And then came the night that changed everything. It was near the end of term, and Harry had a vision. One of the terrible visions that plagued him, showing him things happening far away. He saw Sirius Black, his godfather, being tortured by Voldemort in the Department of Mysteries at the Ministry. Harry was determined to go to mount a rescue, and he asked for help. Hermione and Ron would go, of course. Ginny Weasley insisted on coming. Luna Lovegood, strange, dreamy Luna, who saw things others didn't and believed in creatures most people thought were imaginary, calmly announced she would join them. And Neville, when Harry hesitated to ask him, simply said, "I'm coming too." "Neville, it's going to be dangerous." "I know," Neville interrupted. "I'm still coming. You've been teaching us to fight. Well, now it's time to fight." And so 6 students flew to London on Thestrals, those skeletal, horse-like creatures that could only be seen by those who had witnessed death. Neville couldn't see them, but he trusted Luna's guidance and climbed onto the invisible creature's back, holding tight as they soared through the night sky toward danger. The Department of Mysteries was a strange, eerie place, deep within the Ministry of Magic, filled with locked doors and mysterious chambers. They found the Hall of Prophecy, row upon row of glass spheres containing predictions about the future. And there, in the dim light, they discovered the truth. There was no one there. It had been a trap. Voldemort had lured Harry there using false visions. And then the Death Eaters appeared. They came from the shadows, masked and robed in black, their wands raised, their voices cold with triumph. Lucius Malfoy, Draco's father, stepped forward, demanding that Harry hand over a particular prophecy. And when Harry refused, the battle began. Dear listener, Neville had never been in a real fight before. All his practice in the DA had been exactly that. Practice, spells cast at targets or fellow students who knew it was just training. This was different. This was real. The spells being cast weren't meant to stun or disarm for points in class. They were meant to injure, to capture, to kill. He fought anyway. His spells were clumsy, often missing their targets. His shield charms flickered and failed. He wasn't graceful like Ginny, or clever like Hermione, or powerful like Harry. But he kept fighting. When he was knocked down, he got back up. When his nose was broken by a Death Eater's curse and blood poured down his face, he wiped it away and kept casting spells. They ran through room after room, the time chamber with its bell jar and hummingbird caught in an endless cycle of life and death. The space chamber with its model of the solar system. The brain room with its thoughts swimming in tanks like luminous fish. The Death Eaters pursued them relentlessly. And then, in one terrible moment, Neville saw her. Bellatrix Lestrange. She was dueling with someone else, laughing her mad, cruel laugh, her dark hair wild around her face, her eyes gleaming with malicious joy. And Neville felt something he'd never quite felt before. Pure, burning rage. This was the woman who had destroyed his parents. This was the witch who had tortured them for information they didn't have, who had broken their minds for sport, who had left him with parents who lived but could never truly be his parents again. Without thinking, operating purely on fury and grief and 5 years of accumulated pain, Neville raised his wand and shouted a spell at her. It went wide. Of course, it went wide, because Neville's aim had never been good, even in the best circumstances. But Bellatrix turned, noticing him for the first time. Well, well, she purred, her wand now pointed directly at him. What have we here? Is this little Longbottom, little Neville Longbottom, all grown up and playing a hero? Neville's wand hand was shaking, but he didn't lower it. You killed my parents, he said, his voice rough with emotion and blood from his broken nose. Oh no, Bellatrix corrected, her smile widening. I didn't kill them. I tortured them until they lost their minds. They're alive, aren't they? In St. Mungo's, drooling and empty. That's so much better than being dead, don't you think? She was laughing at him, mocking him, and Neville felt tears of rage and helplessness burning in his eyes. He tried to cast another spell, but she deflected it easily, almost contemptuously, and then she was advancing on him, her wand raised, that terrible smile on her face. And then several things happened very quickly. The Order of the Phoenix arrived. Real adults, experienced wizards and witches led by Albus Dumbledore himself. There was a tremendous battle, flashes of light and explosive sounds, and in the chaos, Bellatrix escaped, cackling with mad delight even in defeat. When it was over, when Sirius Black lay dead, killed by Bellatrix in their final moments of battle, and Voldemort himself had briefly appeared before fleeing from Dumbledore's power, the 6 students were taken to the hospital wing at Hogwarts. Neville's nose was mended, his bruises healed, his cuts sealed. But something inside him had changed, dear listener. Something fundamental had shifted during that battle. He had faced Death Eaters. He had faced the woman who destroyed his family. He had fought, truly fought, even though he'd been terrified, even though his spells had mostly missed, even though he'd been utterly outmatched. He had stood his ground. As Neville lay in the hospital bed that night, staring at the ceiling while Madame Pomfrey bustled about checking on her patients, he thought about his parents. Not as the broken shells they'd become, but as they must have been. Brave auras who had fought against Voldemort, who had stood up to evil knowing the risks, who had chosen courage even when courage meant terrible consequences. they had stood their ground too. And now, finally, Neville understood something he'd been too young and too uncertain to grasp before. Courage wasn't about not being afraid. Courage was about being absolutely terrified and standing firm anyway. It was about having every reason to run and choosing to stay. It was about being the least talented, the clumsiest, the most likely to fail, and trying anyway. His parents had been brave, and so perhaps was he. The realization didn't make him confident. It didn't suddenly transform him into a powerful wizard or a natural leader, but it planted a seed, dear listener, a small seed of self-knowledge that would, in time, grow into something remarkable. When his grandmother visited him in the hospital wing the next day, she didn't scold him for getting hurt or lecture him about being reckless. Instead, she sat beside his bed, took his hand in her wrinkled, strong one, and said quietly, "Your parents would be proud of you, Neville. I'm proud of you." And for once, Neville believed her. The school year ended. Students departed for summer holidays. The Daily Prophet finally admitted what Harry had been saying all along. Voldemort had returned. The Second Wizarding War had officially begun, though it had really started a year earlier, when the Dark Lord had risen from his father's grave and called his Death Eaters back to his side. Neville went home for the summer, but he was different now. He practiced magic during the holidays, really practiced with focus and determination. He read his textbooks not because he had to, but because he wanted to be ready. He tended his grandmother's magical plants with the same care as always, but now he saw them differently, not just as beautiful growing things, but as potential allies, as sources of strength. Because autumn would bring 6 year, and 6 year would bring increased danger, and Neville Longbottom was beginning to understand that the time was coming when he would need every ounce of courage he could find, every spell he could master, every lesson he had learned. The boy who had arrived at Hogwarts, terrified and uncertain, was still there, still present in Neville's round face and gentle hands. But there was something else growing alongside that frightened child, something that had been there all along, but was only now beginning to bloom, like a plant pushing up through dark soil toward the light. Neville's courage was rising, and though he didn't know it yet, that courage would soon be tested in ways he couldn't imagine, would be needed more than he could possibly understand. 6 year arrived with an autumn that felt heavier than usual, dear listener, as though the very air carried the weight of the war that now everyone acknowledged was real. The Daily Prophet no longer denied Voldemort's return. Instead, it reported disappearances, attacks, mysterious deaths with increasing frequency. Families withdrew their children from Hogwarts, fearing the school was no longer safe. Security measures were implemented, protective enchantments strengthened, and a somber atmosphere settled over the castle like morning frost. Neville returned to Hogwarts changed in subtle ways that perhaps only he could fully recognize. He stood a little straighter now. His jaw was set with something that might have been determination. The summer had been spent not just recovering from the Department of Mysteries battle, but preparing for whatever came next. His grandmother, seeing the resolve in his eyes, had taught him some of the spells his father had favored. Practical magic for defense and protection. The kind of knowledge that had served Frank Longbottom well during the First War. The castle felt different too. There were fewer students in the corridors, and those who remained moved with a certain wariness, as though expecting danger to emerge from the very stones. Professor Snape had finally achieved his long-desired position as defense against the dark arts teacher, and Horace Slughorn had returned from retirement to take over potions, a change that Neville greeted with profound relief, though Slughorn's tendency to collect talented students and ignore those he deemed ordinary meant that Neville remained largely invisible in that class as well. But it was in herbology that Neville truly flourished. Now, in his 6th year, he had achieved an outstanding in his OWL exam, one of only a handful of students to do so, and Professor Sprout beamed at him with genuine pride. She began treating him almost as an assistant, asking him to help younger students, trusting him with the more dangerous plants, consulting him about treatments for various magical plant ailments. There was a particular afternoon in October when the leaves outside the greenhouse windows blazed with colour and the air smelled of rich earth and growth, when Professor Sprout asked Neville to help her repot a mature, venomous tentacula. The plant was enormous, its dark purple tentacles writhing with predatory intent, its spines dripping with poison. Most students would have approached such a task with extreme caution, if not outright fear. But Neville moved with quiet confidence, his hands steady as he worked around the thrashing tentacles, murmuring softly to the plant as though it could understand him. And perhaps, in some way, it could, for the tentacula seemed to calm slightly under his touch, its movements becoming less violent, more controlled. Together, Neville and Professor Sprout successfully transplanted the dangerous plant into a larger pot, and when it was done, the professor turned to him with warm eyes. "You have a gift, Mr. Longbottom," she said. "A real gift. Not just knowledge, but understanding. These plants respond to you in ways they don't respond to others. You should be very proud." Neville felt heat rise to his cheeks, but he smiled. "Thank you, Professor. I really love this, working with plants. It's the only time I feel like I actually know what I'm doing." "Then perhaps," Professor Sprout suggested gently, "you should consider that you know what you're doing more often than you think. Confidence in one area can spread to others, you know, like roots spreading through soil." It was good advice, dear listener, though Neville wasn't quite ready to believe it applied to his other classes. Still, something was changing in him. The boy who had cowered under Snape's criticism was learning to endure it with greater resilience. The student who had once been too frightened to answer questions in class was beginning to raise his hand more often, even if his answers weren't always correct. And then there was Luna Lovegood. Luna had been a year behind Neville, sorted into Ravenclaw, and most students found her utterly strange. She believed in creatures that didn't exist, read the Quibbler upside down, and said things that made no logical sense. She was dreamy and distant, seeming to float through the corridors rather than walk, and people tended to either ignore her or mock her behind her back. But Neville had fought beside Luna in the Department of Mysteries. He had seen her courage, her unshakable calm in the face of danger, her absolute certainty that everything would work out as it should. And he had discovered that beneath her odd exterior was someone genuinely kind, deeply loyal, and refreshingly honest. They began spending more time together that year, not dating, nothing so formal as that, but simply existing comfortably in each other's presence. They would sit together in the library, Neville studying herbology texts, while Luna read articles about crumple-horned snorkags. They would walk around the lake on weekend afternoons, Luna pointing out invisible creatures, and Neville identifying the magical plants growing along the shore. They would share comfortable silences that felt more meaningful than many conversations. "You're braver than you think you are," Luna told him one day, her voice carrying that characteristic dreamy quality that made her observations sound like prophecies. Most people don't realize it yet, but they will. When the time comes, you'll be exactly who you need to be. Neville wanted to ask what she meant, but Luna had already drifted on to another topic. Something about how the Thestrals in the Forbidden Forest were planning a migration, which Neville was fairly certain wasn't true. But he nodded anyway, because arguing with Luna was like trying to argue with the wind. The year progressed through its darkening seasons. Professor Dumbledore was often absent from the castle, going on mysterious missions that he didn't explain. Harry Potter was taking private lessons with the headmaster, learning things that he couldn't or wouldn't discuss. There were more attacks reported in the Daily Prophet. Muggles killed, wizarding families targeted. The Muggle Prime Minister himself brought into the secret. And then, on a June night that should have been peaceful, Death Eaters infiltrated Hogwarts. Neville was in Gryffindor Tower when it happened, working on an essay for charms that was already 2 days late. There was a sudden commotion in the corridor, shouting, running feet, flashes of light visible through the windows. He grabbed his wand, his father's wand, still not quite right for him, but the only one he had, and rushed out with several other students to find members of the DA gathering on the stairs. "Death Eaters," Ginny Weasley said, her face pale but determined. "They're in the castle. Harry told us to stay here, but we're not going to," Neville finished, and he was surprised to hear the firmness in his own voice. "We're the DA. We trained for this. We're going to help." And so, a small group of students, Neville, Ginny, Luna, and a few others, stationed themselves in the corridor leading to the room of requirement, ready to prevent any Death Eaters from penetrating further into the castle. They conjured barriers, prepared defensive spells, and waited with wands raised and hearts pounding. The battle, when it reached them, was chaos. Death Eaters came sweeping through the corridors, and the students fought back with everything they had learned. Neville cast stunning spells and shield charms, his movements clumsy but determined, his voice hoarse from shouting incantations. He was knocked off his feet twice, his ribs bruised from a curse that grazed him, his lips split from an impact he didn't even register in the moment. But he kept fighting. At one point, he found himself face to face with a Death Eater whose mask had slipped, a woman with wild eyes and a cruel smile that reminded him terrifyingly of Bellatrix Lestrange. Though this wasn't her. The woman raised her wand, began to cast what looked like a cutting curse, and Neville's disarming charm hit her square in the chest. Her wand flew from her hand, arcing through the air, and she stumbled backward in surprise. Neville stared at his own wand in shock. The spell had actually worked, had worked exactly when he needed it to, had possibly just saved his life. And then someone was pulling him back, Ginny's voice in his ear telling him to move, to keep going. The battle ended with Dumbledore's death, the greatest wizard of the age, the one person Voldemort truly feared, was killed by Severus Snape on the astronomy tower, while students fought Death Eaters in the corridors below. The news rippled through the school like a shockwave, leaving everyone stunned and grieving and terrified. If Dumbledore could be killed, if even he wasn't safe, then what hope did any of them have? Neville stood at Dumbledore's funeral, watching the white tomb that had been conjured to hold the headmaster's body, and he felt something hardening inside him. Grief, yes. Fear, absolutely. But also determination, also rage, also the absolute certainty that he could not, would not, stand by while Voldemort and his Death Eaters destroyed everything good in the wizarding world. His parents had fought. His parents had sacrificed everything. And Neville, clumsy, forgetful, anxious Neville, would honor them by fighting too. The summer between 6th and 7th year was unlike any that had come before, dear listener. The Ministry of Magic had fallen to Voldemort's control. The new regime was led by Death Eaters wearing bureaucratic masks, implementing laws that persecuted Muggle-borns and half-bloods, creating a climate of fear and suspicion. Harry Potter was declared undesirable number 1, wanted for questioning about Dumbledore's death, and a reward was offered for information leading to his capture. Neville spent that summer at his grandmother's house, but both of them knew that the relative safety they'd always enjoyed was evaporating. Augusta Longbottom had been a student at Hogwarts when Grindelwald had threatened the wizarding world, and she recognized the signs of a dark wizard's rise to power. She sat Neville down one evening in the parlor, the windows darkened against potential spies, and spoke to him with absolute seriousness. "Neville, I want you to understand something," she said, her weathered hands folded in her lap, her vulture-topped hat sitting perfectly straight despite the gravity of the moment. "The year ahead will be dangerous. Hogwarts will not be the safe haven it once was. Voldemort controls the ministry, and he will control the school as well. You will need to make choices about who you are and what you stand for." "I know, Gran," Neville said quietly. "Your parents," she continued, her voice softening just slightly, "made their choice. They chose to fight, even knowing the cost might be terrible. They chose courage over safety, principle over comfort. And I have never been more proud of anyone in my entire life than I am, of Frank and Alice." She paused, and when she spoke again, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady as stone. "If you choose to fight, Neville, if you choose to resist, I will support you completely. And if something should happen to you, if the worst should occur, I want you to know that I would be honored to have raised such a brave young man, honored to call you my grandson." Neville felt tears burning in his own eyes. His grandmother had never spoken to him this way before, had never suggested that he might be capable of the kind of courage his parents had shown. "I'm scared, Gran," he admitted. "Good," she said firmly. "Only fools are fearless. Brave people are scared and do what needs doing anyway. Now there are some things I need to teach you before you return to school. Spells your father used, techniques that might save your life or the lives of others. We have a few weeks left. Let's not waste them." And so Augusta Longbottom, that formidable witch who had seemed to Neville like an impossible standard he could never meet, became his teacher and ally. She taught him defensive magic that wasn't in any textbook, showed him how to cast a Patronus charm, though Neville's remained incorporeal, a silver mist rather than an animal form, it was still more than he'd managed before. She drilled him on shield charms until he could cast them almost reflexively, on stunning spells, until his aim improved from terrible to merely poor. They worked in the garden among the magical plants, and Augusta showed him how certain species could be used in defense. Snargaluff pods that could be thrown like grenades, devil's snare that could entangle enemies, Mimbletonia that could provide cover with its stink sap. Neville absorbed it all, his hands moving with confidence among the plants, his mind cataloguing properties and possibilities. "You're good at this," his grandmother observed one afternoon, watching him carefully extract pods from a particularly aggressive Snargaluff. "Better than good. You have your mother's gift with growing things." Alice could make anything bloom, even in the darkest times. It was one of the few times she had spoken of his mother in terms that weren't about courage or sacrifice or duty, and Neville felt a warm glow of connection, not to the broken woman in St. Mungo's, but to the person his mother had been before Bellatrix Lestrange had destroyed her mind. "I miss them," he said quietly, still focused on the Snargaluff. "I know I can't really miss them because I never knew them properly, but I miss who they could have been, who they would have been if." "I know," Augusta said, and her hand rested briefly on his shoulder. "I miss them too, every single day. But Neville, they live on in you, in your kindness, in your determination, in your stubborn refusal to give up even when everything seems hopeless. That's Frank and Alice. That's your inheritance, more valuable than any amount of gold." When September arrived and it was time to return to Hogwarts, Neville packed his trunk with more than just school books and robes. He packed the knowledge his grandmother had given him, the techniques he'd practiced all summer, the understanding that sometimes love meant letting people walk into danger because it was the right thing to do. Augusta saw him off at King's Cross Station, and for the first time in his life she hugged him, a brief, fierce embrace that spoke of pride and love and fear and hope all tangled together. "Make them proud," she whispered. "I'll try, Gran." "You already do," she said, pulling back to look at him properly. "Now go. And Neville, don't forget to write. I want to know you're safe." But they both knew that safety was no longer something anyone could promise, dear listener. The Hogwarts Express pulled away from the platform, carrying students toward a school that would be more prison than sanctuary, toward a year that would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, toward choices that would define the rest of their lives. Neville watched the countryside slide past the window, his hands resting on his knees, his father's wand in his pocket, and his mother's gentle strength in his heart. Beside him, Luna hummed a wordless tune, utterly unconcerned about whatever awaited them. Across from him, Ginny Weasley sat with her jaw set and her eyes fierce, clearly already planning some form of resistance. They didn't know yet that Harry, Ron, and Hermione wouldn't be returning to school. They didn't know that the castle would be ruled by Death Eaters wearing professorial robes. They didn't know that the year ahead would require every ounce of courage they possessed and then demand more still. But Neville was ready. Not confident, not powerful, not naturally talented, but ready in the way that mattered most, willing to stand when others fell, willing to fight when fighting seemed futile, willing to be the person his parents had believed he could be, even if they could no longer remember they had a son. The train carried them north through the gathering dusk. toward Hogwarts, and toward destiny, and Neville Longbottom sat quietly among his friends, a round-faced boy with gentle hands and a courage that was only beginning to bloom. The Hogwarts Express arrived at Hogsmeade Station under a sky heavy with clouds that seemed to press down upon the world like a physical weight, dear listener. As the students disembarked, there was none of the usual excitement, none of the cheerful chaos that had marked the beginning of every previous school year. Instead, there was a strange, subdued quality to the crowd. Voices were quieter, movements more cautious, as though everyone instinctively understood that something fundamental had changed. The carriages that carried students up to the castle were pulled, as always, by thestrals, those skeletal horses visible only to those who had witnessed death. Neville still couldn't see them, though he knew they were there, and he climbed into a carriage with Luna and Ginny, settling onto the worn velvet seats as the invisible creatures began their journey up the winding path to the school. "It's going to be different this year," Ginny said quietly, staring out at the darkening landscape. "Harry's not here. Ron and Hermione aren't here. Half the DA didn't come back." "Then we'll have to be enough," Neville replied, surprising himself with the steadiness of his own voice. "The ones who are here will have to be enough." Luna turned her wide, silvery eyes on him, and that dreamy smile touched her lips. "You already are enough, Neville. You just haven't noticed yet." The castle loomed before them, its familiar towers and turrets looking somehow more ominous than welcoming. When they entered the great hall for the start of term feast, the differences became immediately, painfully clear. The staff table had changed. Professor McGonagall sat tight-lipped and rigid, her expression suggesting she was holding back fury through sheer force of will. Beside her sat Severus Snape, now headmaster of Hogwarts, his dark eyes surveying the students with cold satisfaction. And there, in positions that should have been filled by kind professors who cared about education, sat Death Eaters wearing academic robes like costumes. Alecto Carrow, squat and toad-like, would be teaching Muggle studies, though what she would teach could hardly be called education. Her brother, Amicus Carrow, thick-necked and cruel-eyed, had taken over defense against the dark arts, though the subject had been renamed. Now it was simply called dark arts, the defense against, having been removed like an inconvenient truth. The sorting proceeded in uncomfortable silence. The sorting hat song that year carried a warning tone, speaking of unity and courage in dark times, and Neville wondered if an ancient magical hat could feel despair, because there seemed to be sadness woven through every verse. When the feast finally began, the food was as plentiful as ever. House elves in the kitchens below still worked their magic, but it tasted like ashes in Neville's mouth. He forced himself to eat anyway, knowing he would need strength for whatever came next. Snape stood to address the school, his voice silky and cold as he outlined the new rules. There would be stricter curfews. There would be harsher punishments for rule breaking. There would be absolutely no tolerance for disloyalty to the new regime, and students would learn what was proper, what was correct, what the Ministry, which was to say, what Voldemort wanted them to know. Any student found to be in possession of banned materials, spreading false information, or engaging in rebellious activities will be subject to severe discipline, Snape said, his gaze sweeping across the hall. The Carrows will be administering punishments as they see fit, I suggest you all remember that Hogwarts is a place of learning, and you would do well to learn quickly what is expected of you. After the feast, as students filed out toward their common rooms, Neville caught a glimpse of Professor McGonagall's face. She looked older, more worn, and absolutely furious. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Neville understood. She would resist in whatever way she could, but she was trapped by her position, forced to watch Death Eaters corrupt the school she loved while being powerless to stop them directly. If the professors couldn't fight openly, then the students would have to fight for them. The first week of term revealed just how thoroughly Hogwarts had been corrupted, dear listener. In Muggle studies, Alecto Caro taught that Muggles were barely better than animals, that they were subhuman creatures who stole magic from wizards, that they deserved whatever happened to them. Students were required to write essays on the inferiority of Muggle-born wizards, on the superiority of pure blood families, on the necessity of maintaining blood purity. In dark arts, Amicus Caro taught curses, not how to defend against them, but how to perform them. He had students practice the Cruciatus curse on those who earned detentions, laughing his horrible laugh as children screamed under the torture of other children. "You need to mean it," he would shout. "Feel the desire to cause pain. That's the only way the curse works properly." Neville watched in horror as the school he loved was transformed into something twisted and wrong. Students walked the corridors with hunched shoulders and fearful eyes. Those who spoke out of turn disappeared to detentions and returned with burns, cuts, bruises. The Caros seemed to take particular pleasure in tormenting Muggle-born students and blood traitors, those pure bloods who refused to accept Voldemort's ideology. But Neville had not come to 7th year to endure quietly. He sought out Ginny and Luna within the first few days, and together they made a decision. They would reform Dumbledore's army. Not openly, of course. That would be suicide. But secretly, they would resist. They would help students who were targeted. They would undermine the Caro's teachings. They would make sure that Hogwarts, even under Death Eater control, remained a place where courage and kindness still existed. Their first act of rebellion was small, but significant. The Caros had removed the portrait of Dumbledore from the headmaster's office and replaced it with a tapestry depicting Salazar Slytherin. In the dead of night, Neville, Ginny, and Luna snuck through the corridors to the 7th floor and used paint they charmed to be permanent to write on the walls. Dumbledore's army, still recruiting. By morning, the message had been discovered. The Caros were furious. They questioned students, threatened detentions, tried to force someone to confess. But no one spoke. Even students who weren't part of the resistance protected those who were, understanding that solidarity was their only defense against tyranny. The Caros painted over the message, but the next night it appeared again, and again, and again. Each time it was removed, it would reappear somewhere new, on different walls, in different corridors, sometimes accompanied by additional messages. Support Harry Potter, or Voldemort is lying to you, or simply resist. Neville became the de facto leader of this new DA, dear listener, though leadership sat awkwardly on his shoulders. He had never seen himself as a leader, had never imagined others would look to him for guidance. But with Harry gone, with the older students either having left school or been cowed into submission, someone needed to step forward. And Neville, who had spent his entire life being overlooked and underestimated, discovered that being underestimated could be an advantage. The Carrows never suspected him. After all, he was just Neville Longbottom, the clumsy boy who melted cauldrons, who forgot passwords, who could barely cast a proper shield charm. What threat could he possibly pose? But that clumsy boy had spent a summer learning defensive magic from his formidable grandmother. That forgetful student had fought Death Eaters in the Department of Mysteries, and again in the battle for Hogwarts the previous June. That gentle soul had within him a core of absolute determination, strengthened by years of quiet endurance and hardened by the knowledge of what Voldemort's followers had done to his parents. The DA met in the Room of Requirement, that magical space that appeared when needed and transformed itself to suit its purpose. For them, it became a sanctuary, a place with comfortable furniture, supplies of food for students who were being starved as punishment, healing salves for those who had endured the Carrows' torture, and walls covered with encouraging messages and photos of happier times. They practiced defensive spells, though they had to be careful not to make too much noise. They planned acts of resistance, freeing students locked in dungeons, stealing back confiscated wands, sabotaging the Carrows' lessons in small ways. Neville taught them everything his grandmother had taught him, everything he'd learned from Harry during their previous DA meetings, everything he'd discovered through his own desperate practice. Shield charms, he would say, demonstrating the wand movement. They don't have to be perfect. They just have to be there when you need them. Try again. And students would try and fail and try again. And Neville would offer patient encouragement because he understood better than anyone what it felt like to struggle, to fail repeatedly, to wonder if you would ever get it right. As autumn deepened into winter, the punishments grew worse. The Carrows seemed to delight in cruelty, administering torture as casually as other teachers might assign homework. Students returned from detentions with the word mudblood carved into their skin, with broken bones that Madame Pomfrey would heal while her lips trembled with suppressed rage, with nightmares that made them wake screaming in the night. And through it all, the DA continued to resist. They organized a protest during a particularly vile Muggle studies lesson. All the students simply standing up and walking out while Alecto Carrow shrieked threats behind them. They enchanted the suits of armor throughout the castle to trip Death Eaters and visiting ministry officials. They broke into Snape's office and stole back wands that had been confiscated from Muggle-born students, returning them under cover of darkness. Neville found himself growing bolder with each act of resistance, dear listener. The fear was still there. It was always there, a constant companion that made his hands shake and his heart race. But he had learned to act despite the fear, to push forward even when every instinct screamed at him to hide. There was one particularly dangerous mission in December when they learned that a group of first years, Muggle-borns, all of them, were going to be used for demonstration purposes in an advanced dark arts lesson. Amicus Carrow planned to have older students practice curses on them. Neville, Ginny, and Luna intervened before the lesson could begin. They created a diversion using Peruvian instant darkness powder, something the Weasley twins had invented. And in the chaos and confusion, they guided the first years to safety in the room of requirement. Amicus Carrow was furious, storming through corridors and threatening terrible punishments for whoever was responsible. He never suspected Neville, who sat quietly in the common room that evening, with a herbology textbook open on his lap, his round face showing nothing but innocent concentration, while inside his heart hammered with a mixture of terror and triumph. By winter, the room of requirement had become more than just a meeting place for the DA. It had become a refuge for students who had nowhere else to go. Some stayed there full time, hiding from the Carrows, sleeping on conjured beds, eating food that appeared mysteriously. Neville suspected the house elves were helping, bless them. It was a small pocket of resistance, a place where Dumbledore's vision of Hogwarts, a place of learning and acceptance and courage, still survived. Neville found himself spending more and more time there, coordinating resistance efforts, caring for traumatized students, planning their next moves. Luna was often by his side, her calm presence soothing in the chaos, her strange observations sometimes containing deeper wisdom than they first appeared. Ginny was fierce and determined, never backing down, always ready to fight. But then Luna was taken. She had gone home for Christmas. Her father had insisted, wanting to see her, and she simply never returned. Rumours filtered back through various sources. Luna's father had printed an article in the Quibbler supporting Harry Potter, and in retaliation, Death Eaters had kidnapped Luna. She was being held somewhere, a hostage to ensure her father's cooperation. Neville felt her absence like a physical wound. Sweet, strange Luna, who had fought beside him in the Department of Mysteries, who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself, who had seen courage in him before he'd known it was there. She was gone, taken by the same evil that had destroyed his parents, and he was powerless to save her. The rage and grief he felt hardened into something like steel inside him, dear listener. This was what Voldemort did. This was what the Death Eaters did. They took good people, brave people, kind people, and they hurt them, broke them, used them as weapons against those who loved them. They had done it to his parents. They had done it to Luna. They would keep doing it unless someone stopped them. Spring came, but it brought no warmth to Hogwarts. If anything, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. More students disappeared, sent home by terrified parents, or arrested on false charges, or simply vanishing without explanation. The DA continued to resist, but they were tired, worn down by months of constant vigilance and danger. And then came the mission that almost broke them. In late April, Neville learned that the Sword of Gryffindor, that legendary blade said to appear to any worthy Gryffindor in need, was being kept in Snape's office. The sword was important somehow, though Neville didn't know why. Harry had used it to kill the basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets years ago. It was a symbol of Gryffindor courage, and the Death Eaters had it, were keeping it locked away like a trophy. Neville decided they needed to steal it. It was a terrible plan, doomed from the start, but Neville was running on rage and grief and desperation by then. He, Ginny, and Seamus Finnegan, one of the few DA members still operating outside the room of requirement, broke into Snape's office in the dead of night. They disabled the wards, picked the locks, found the case where the sword was kept. But the sword they found was a fake, a goblin-made replica that looked right but felt wrong. And before they could escape, Snape appeared, drawn by some silent alarm they hadn't detected. For a terrible moment, Neville thought they would be subjected to the Cruciatus curse right there in the office. Thought Snape would summon the Carrows, and they would all be tortured until they revealed every DA member's name. But instead, Snape did something unexpected. He gave them detention with Hagrid in the Forbidden Forest. It was still a punishment. The forest was dangerous, especially at night, but it was mercy compared to what the Carrows would have done. As Hagrid led them into the dark trees, apologizing in his gruff way that it had to be detention at all, Neville wondered if maybe, possibly, Snape was not quite what he seemed. It was a fleeting thought, quickly dismissed, but it lingered in the back of his mind like a question that wouldn't quite resolve itself. After that failed mission, Neville and the remaining DA members retreated more permanently to the Room of Requirement. They were covered in bruises and cuts from the Carrows' punishments, exhausted from months of resistance. But they refused to give up. The room provided everything they needed: food, beds, even a tunnel that led to the Hogshead pub in Hogsmeade, though they rarely used it. They lived there in a strange kind of limbo, dear listener, still attending some classes to avoid suspicion, but spending most of their time in their hidden sanctuary, caring for each other, keeping a hope alive through the sheer stubborn refusal to let it die. Neville bore scars now, both visible and invisible. The word Dumbledore had been carved into his cheek by Amicus Carrow during one detention. Madame Pomfrey had healed it somewhat, but the scar remained, a badge of resistance that Neville wore without shame. His body was mapped with bruises in various stages of healing. His father's wand had finally broken during a scuffle with a Death Eater, and he'd had to take a wand from an unconscious snatcher, a wand that fit him even worse than his father's had. But his spirit, against all odds, remained unbroken, because Neville Longbottom had discovered something about himself during that terrible year, dear listener. He had discovered that courage wasn't something you were born with. It was something you chose again and again, even when choosing it hurt. He had discovered that he was stronger than he'd ever imagined, not because he was powerful or talented, but because he absolutely refused to stop standing up, no matter how many times he was knocked down. His parents had fought Voldemort. They had stood against evil even knowing the cost. And now, in his own way, Neville was doing the same. Not with the skill and power of trained Aurors, but with the stubborn resistance of a boy who had spent his whole life being underestimated and had learned to use that underestimation as a weapon. As May arrived and the end of the school year approached, Neville and the DA waited in the Room of Requirement, tending their wounds and gathering their strength. They didn't know that Harry Potter was hunting Horcruxes, didn't know that the final battle was approaching, didn't know that everything they had endured was about to be tested in ways they couldn't imagine. But they knew one thing with absolute certainty. When the moment came, they would be ready. The night of May 2nd began quietly, dear listener, with no warning that it would be the night when everything changed. Neville sat in the Room of Requirement, surrounded by the remaining members of Dumbledore's army, students who had lived there for weeks now, hiding from the Carrows, surviving on conjured food and determination. The room had transformed itself into a makeshift dormitory, with hammocks strung between pillars and sleeping bags scattered across the floor. It smelled of unwashed bodies and desperation, but also of something else, of defiance, of hope that refused to die. Neville was attempting to sleep, his body aching from the day's punishments. Amicus Carrow had caught him helping a first year who'd been crying in the corridor and had used the Cruciatus curse as discipline. The memory of that pain still echoed through Neville's nerves, making his hands tremble slightly as he tried to find a comfortable position in his hammock. He thought, as he often did, of his parents, of how they had endured this curse again and again until their minds shattered, and he marveled, not for the first time, at their strength. Then, without warning, there was a sound from the tunnel. Everyone in the room went silent, hands reaching for wands, bodies tensing for fight or flight. The tunnel that led to the Hogshead pub in Hogsmeade had been quiet for days. Aberforth Dumbledore, who owned the pub and who had been secretly helping them, had warned that Death Eaters were watching the village more carefully than ever. But now, someone was coming through. Neville moved to the tunnel entrance, his borrowed wand raised, his heart hammering in his chest. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by voices, multiple people speaking in hushed, urgent tones. And then, a figure emerged from the darkness, and Neville's wand hand dropped in shock. Harry? Harry Potter stood before him, looking thin and exhausted, his clothes torn and dirty, his face haggard. Behind him came Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger, equally worn but alive, wonderfully alive. For a moment, Neville could only stare, unable to quite believe what he was seeing. Then the room of requirement erupted in noise, students shouting, crying, rushing forward to greet the three friends they hadn't seen in nearly a year. "Neville," Harry said, and there was something in his voice that made everyone fall silent. "We need to get into the castle. We need to find something hidden here, a Horcrux. Voldemort's last Horcrux." Neville didn't fully understand what a Horcrux was, but the urgency in Harry's voice was clear. "Right," he said, his mind already working. "We can get you in." The room of requirement opens onto the 7th floor corridor. But Harry, the castle is crawling with Death Eaters. The Carrows, Snape. "I know," Harry interrupted. "But we have to try. This is it, Neville. This is how we end it. We find the Horcrux, we destroy it, and then we finish this." And just like that, dear listener, the waiting was over. The long months of resistance and hiding and endurance had been building to this moment, though none of them had known it. Harry was here. The war was coming to Hogwarts, and everything they had suffered through would either be vindicated or rendered meaningless, depending on what happened next. The word spread through the castle with remarkable speed, passed from portrait to portrait, whispered through common rooms, sent via Patronus messages that flickered through corridors like silver messengers of hope. Harry Potter had returned. The final battle was beginning, and every student, every professor who had endured the Carrows regime, who had held on to their principles through the darkness, understood that now was the time to stand. Professor McGonagall took control of the castle with swift, fierce efficiency. She dueled Snape himself, driving him from the school with a fury that spoke of months of suppressed rage finally unleashed. She activated ancient protective enchantments around Hogwarts and called the other heads of house to help fortify the defenses. The castle itself seemed to wake, as though it had been waiting for this moment, and suits of armor marched to defensive positions, while statues came to life, ready to protect the school. "We must evacuate the younger students," McGonagall announced, her voice carrying through the Great Hall where students and professors had gathered. Everyone under 17 must leave immediately. The rest of you, this is your choice. You may leave if you wish, or you may stay and fight. Neville stood among the crowd of students, his wand gripped tightly in his hand, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was staying. This was what everything had been leading to. Every failed spell in first year, every act of resistance in seventh year, every moment of fear transformed into action. His parents had fought Voldemort. His grandmother had prepared him to fight. And Luna, sweet Luna, who was imprisoned somewhere because she had dared to be kind and brave, needed someone to fight for her. He was staying. The younger students were evacuated through various passages, sent to safety in Hogsmeade and beyond. But hundreds stayed, students and professors, house elves from the kitchens. Even the ghosts seemed to hover more solidly than usual, ready to help defend their home. The Order of the Phoenix arrived, led by Kingsley Shacklebolt, bringing reinforcements, experienced fighters who had battled Death Eaters before. And then Voldemort's forces appeared on the grounds. They came like a dark tide, hundreds of Death Eaters in their masks and robes, giants lumbering among them, Dementors floating above like harbingers of despair, werewolves and snatchers, and every dark creature that had allied itself with the Dark Lord. They surrounded the castle, and Voldemort's voice spoke, magically amplified, cold as winter ice. "I know you are preparing to fight," the voice said, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Your efforts are futile. I do not wish to spill magical blood. Give me Harry Potter, and none shall be harmed. Give me Harry Potter, and I shall leave the school untouched. You have until midnight." The silence that followed was terrible. Neville could feel eyes turning toward Harry, could sense the temptation rippling through the hall. Give him up, save themselves, end this before it began. But then Professor McGonagall stepped forward, her wand raised, her voice like steel. "Hogwarts does not bargain with terrorists. We will fight." The protective enchantments held for a time, dear listener. Shimmering barriers of magic that kept Voldemort's forces at bay. But everyone knew they wouldn't hold forever. Inside the castle, defenders took up positions, at windows, in towers, along corridors, anywhere they might make a stand. Neville found himself stationed near the entrance hall with a mixed group of students and Order members, ready for when the Death Eaters inevitably broke through. The waiting was almost worse than the fighting. Neville's hands shook as he gripped his wand. His mouth was dry. His heart felt like it might hammer its way right out of his chest. He thought of his parents, of how they must have felt before the final battle of the First War, knowing they might not survive but standing firm anyway. And then the barriers fell, and the Death Eaters came flooding in. The battle was chaos incarnate, flashes of light in a dozen colors, explosions that shook the ancient stones, screams and shouts, and the terrible sounds of curses finding their marks. Neville fought with everything he had, casting shield charms and stunning spells, dodging curses that sizzled past his head, helping fallen defenders to their feet and back into the fight. He saw Professor McGonagall dueling 3 Death Eaters at once, her wand moving in precise, deadly patterns. He saw Ginny Weasley fighting alongside her family, the Weasleys forming a tight unit of coordinated defense. He saw house elves wielding kitchen knives against the shins of Death Eaters, squeaking battle cries as they fought to protect their school. and he saw people fall. Lavender Brown, attacked by a werewolf. Colin Creevey, small and brave and dead before he should have even been there. Fred Weasley, caught in an explosion, his body still and broken while his twins screamed in anguish. The cost of resistance was written in blood on the castle floors. And still they fought, because what else could they do? Neville took a curse to the shoulder that sent him spinning, pain blooming hot and fierce. He stumbled, fell, his borrowed wand skittering across the floor. A Death Eater loomed over him, wand raised for a killing blow. And then, Seamus was there, his blasting curse sending the Death Eater flying backward. "Get up, Neville," Seamus shouted, pulling him to his feet. "We're not done yet." And they weren't. They kept fighting, kept standing, kept defending their school even as the battle raged around them, and the casualties mounted, and hope began to feel like a foolish dream they'd all shared and would all die for. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Voldemort's voice rang out again, calling for a ceasefire. Harry Potter had 1 hour to surrender himself in the Forbidden Forest, or the battle would resume and every defender would be killed. The silence that followed was deafening. Death Eaters withdrew to regroup. Defenders stumbled to the Great Hall, where the wounded were being tended and the dead were being laid out in respectful rows. Neville walked among the fallen, his throat tight with grief. He recognized so many faces, fellow students, kind professors, order members who had protected him. The price of freedom lay before him in broken bodies and extinguished lives, and he wanted to rage against it, to scream that it wasn't fair, that these people shouldn't have had to die. But he knew that they had died for something worth dying for. They had died fighting against tyranny, against the darkness that would consume everything if left unchecked. They had died the way his parents would have died if Bellatrix Lestrange had been less cruel and more merciful. The hour passed in terrible suspense. No one knew if Harry would surrender himself, though Neville hoped desperately that he wouldn't, that they would find another way, that the boy who lived wouldn't have to die to defeat Voldemort. But when the hour ended and Voldemort's forces appeared again on the grounds, Harry Potter was not among the defenders. He had gone to the forest. He had surrendered himself. And then Death Eaters were marching toward the castle in a grim procession, and at their head walked Voldemort himself, terrible and pale and triumphant. In the arms of the giant Hagrid, who wept openly, was the body of Harry Potter, limp and lifeless. "Harry Potter is dead," Voldemort announced, his voice filled with savage joy. "He was killed as he ran away, trying to save himself while you laid down your lives for him. Your hero is dead." The words hit Neville like physical blows. Harry couldn't be dead. Harry Potter, who had taught them to fight, who had led them, who had been their hope, he couldn't be gone. But there was the body, undeniably real, carried by a heartbroken Hagrid, and Voldemort's laugh echoed across the grounds like the death knell of hope itself. "Join me," Voldemort said, addressing the defenders. "Kneel and pledge your loyalty, and you will be spared. Resist, and you will share Potter's fate." Silence. No one moved. No one spoke. And then Voldemort's gaze fell on Neville, still standing at the front of the group despite his injuries, despite his grief, despite everything. "You there," Voldemort said. "You are a pure blood. You could be useful. What is your name?" "Neville Longbottom," he answered, his voice surprisingly steady. Voldemort's lipless mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. Ah, yes, the son of the Auras. Your parents fought bravely, I'm told, though it gained them nothing but madness. Join me, Neville Longbottom. Pledge your loyalty, and you can have power beyond. I'll join you when hell freezes over, Neville shouted, and the words burst from him with all the fury and grief and defiance he'd been holding inside. Dumbledore's army. The cry was taken up by other voices, students and professors shouting their allegiance not to a dark lord, but to the memory of a man who had believed in love and courage and choice. Voldemort's expression darkened, and with a casual flick of his wand, he summoned the sorting hat, placed it on Neville's head, and set it on fire. Pain exploded through Neville's skull as the flames engulfed him, dear listener. He felt his skin blistering, smelled his own hair burning, knew in that terrible moment that he was going to die just like Harry had died, just like so many others had died. But he refused to scream. He refused to give Voldemort the satisfaction. If he was going to die, he would die standing, defiant to the very end. And then something extraordinary happened. The sorting hat, even as it burned, delivered something into Neville's hands, something heavy and cool and somehow familiar, though he'd never held it before. He ripped the burning hat from his head and looked down at what he was holding, the sword of Gryffindor. The true sword, not the fake they'd tried to steal from Snape's office. The legendary blade that appeared to worthy Gryffindors in times of need. It had come to him, to Neville Longbottom, the boy who had spent his whole life being told he wasn't good enough, wasn't brave enough, wasn't worthy of his family name. The sword had come to him. Time seemed to slow. Neville then looked at the blade, seeing his reflection distorted in the polished steel. A round-faced boy with burns on his scalp, blood on his clothes, exhaustion in his eyes, but also something else. Determination, courage, the same look his father must have worn when fighting Voldemort's followers, the same expression his mother must have had when she refused to betray her friends, even under torture. He looked up at Voldemort, who was staring at the sword, with an expression that might have been shock, might have been fear. And then Neville looked at the massive snake coiled near Voldemort's feet. Nagini, the Dark Lord's familiar, the last Horcrux that tethered Voldemort to life. In that moment, Neville understood what he had to do. He had spent his entire Hogwarts career studying plants, learning about magical creatures, understanding the natural world in ways that combat magic had never quite made sense to him. He knew how snakes moved, how they struck, how they could be vulnerable even when they seemed most dangerous. And he knew, with the certainty that comes from deep knowledge rather than conscious thought, exactly how to strike. Voldemort raised his wand. Death Eaters surged forward, but Neville was already moving, his body acting on instinct, and 7 years of training and a lifetime of quiet determination. He swung the sword of Gryffindor in a perfect arc, and the blade, goblin-made, indestructible, absorbing only that which made it stronger, sliced through Nagini's thick body as though the snake were nothing more than smoke. The snake's severed head fell to the ground. The body thrashed once, twice, and then went still, and Voldemort screamed. It was a sound unlike anything Neville had ever heard, a cry of fury and pain and sudden terrible vulnerability. The last Horcrux was destroyed. The Dark Lord was mortal again, fully mortal, and suddenly the battle resumed with renewed ferocity as defenders realized what Neville had done, realized that Voldemort could be killed now, could be defeated. What happened next became legend, dear listener. Harry Potter, who had not been dead, but had sacrificed himself in a way that protected all the defenders, revealed himself and dueled Voldemort in the Great Hall while the battle raged around them. And when the final spell was cast, when Voldemort's own killing curse rebounded and struck him down, it was because Neville had destroyed the final piece of the Dark Lord's fragmented soul. Neville Longbottom, the boy who couldn't remember passwords and melted cauldrons and lost his toad every other day, had struck the blow that made it possible to defeat the darkest wizard in history. When the battle finally ended, when the last Death Eater had fled or surrendered, when the sun rose over Hogwarts to reveal a castle battered but standing, Neville sat on the front steps with the sword of Gryffindor across his knees and let himself finally cry for the friends who had fallen, for his parents who would never know what he had done, for Luna, who he hoped was safe somewhere, for the boy he had been when he first arrived at Hogwarts, terrified and uncertain, and for the man he had somehow become. Ginny found him there and sat beside him without speaking, and together they watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, a new day dawning over a world finally free from Voldemort's shadow. "You did it," Ginny said quietly. "Neville, you actually did it." "We all did it," he replied, his voice hoarse from smoke and shouting and emotion. "Everyone who fought, everyone who resisted, we all did it together." But they both knew that Neville's blow against Nagini would be remembered for as long as wizards told stories, that his moment of perfect courage would echo through history alongside Harry's sacrifice and Dumbledore's wisdom. The boy who almost was had become the hero he was always meant to be. The days following the Battle of Hogwarts passed in a strange haze, dear listener, as though the world itself was trying to catch its breath after holding it for so long. The castle was damaged, but not broken. Scourge marks on ancient walls, cracked windows, holes in floors where curses had struck, yet somehow still standing, still home. The wounded were tended in the hospital wing and in makeshift infirmaries set up throughout the school. The dead were mourned in a service that brought the entire wizarding community together in shared grief and gratitude. Neville attended that service with burns still healing on his scalp, his borrowed wand tucked in his pocket, the memory of the sword of Gryffindor's weight in his hands still vivid. He stood among the survivors and listened to names being read. Fred Weasley, Remus Lupin, Nymphadora Tonks, Colin Creevey, Lavender Brown, so many others who had given everything so that the rest might live in freedom. Each name was a stone added to the weight he carried, a reminder of the cost of courage. But there were also reunions, joyful and tearful. Luna Lovegood was found and freed from the cellar where she'd been held prisoner at Malfoy Manor, and when she returned to Hogwarts and found Neville, she simply walked up to him and hugged him tightly, her silvery eyes bright with tears. "I knew you'd be all right," she said in that dreamy voice he'd missed so desperately. "The Nargles told me. And besides, you're much braver than you think you are. I told you that, didn't I?" "You did," Neville replied, his own eyes stinging. "You were right, about a lot of things." His grandmother arrived at Hogwarts the day after the battle, and when she saw Neville, bruised and burned and exhausted but alive, so wonderfully alive, she did something she had never done before. She pulled him into a fierce embrace and held him for a long moment, her weathered hands gripping his shoulders as though to assure herself he was real. "Your parents," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "would be so proud, Neville. I'm so proud. You stood when it mattered most. You were exactly who they raised you to be." And Neville understood, finally, that he had been carrying an impossible burden all these years, trying to live up to the memory of parents who had been frozen in time as perfect heroes, trying to match a legacy that seemed too large for someone like him to fill. But the truth was simpler and more profound. His parents had been brave, not because they were perfect, but because they had chosen to stand against evil despite their fear. They had been human, flawed, scared, and they had fought anyway, just like he had. The wizarding world, once it fully comprehended what had happened in the Battle of Hogwarts, wanted to celebrate their heroes. Harry Potter, of course, was hailed as the vanquisher of Voldemort, the boy who lived becoming the man who conquered. But the story of Neville Longbottom spread just as widely. The tale of a quiet boy who had spent years being overlooked and underestimated, who had led the resistance at Hogwarts during the darkest year, who had pulled the sword of Gryffindor from a burning hat and destroyed the final Horcrux with a single perfect strike. The Daily Prophet wanted interviews. The Ministry wanted to give him awards. People on the street wanted to shake his hand and thank him and tell him he was a hero. Neville endured it all with characteristic humility, uncomfortable with the attention, always quick to deflect credit to others who had fought beside him. "I just did what needed doing," he would say, his round face flushing with embarrassment. Everyone at Hogwarts that year was brave. Everyone in the battle fought. I was in the right place at the right time. But those who knew him better understood that it was more than that. It was a lifetime of small choices, to keep trying when spells failed, to stand up when he was frightened, to care for plants with gentle patience, to search for Trevor night after night, to refuse to give up even when giving up would have been so much easier. It was 7 years of slow, steady growth, of courage accumulating like water filling a cup drop by a precious drop, until the moment came when it overflowed and changed everything. In the months following the war, dear listener, the wizarding world began the long process of healing and rebuilding. Death Eaters were tried and sentenced. The Ministry was reorganized under new leadership. Hogwarts was repaired, stone by stone, spell by spell, until the castle stood proud once more, ready to welcome students back for a new term. And Neville had to decide what to do with the rest of his life. He could have done anything, really. The boy who slayed Nagini and helped defeat Voldemort could have walked into any career he wanted. The Ministry would have been happy to have him as an auror. Following in his parents' footsteps, he could have gone into politics, or taken a position researching defensive magic, or simply lived quietly on the fame he'd earned. But when Neville thought about what he wanted, truly wanted, deep in his heart, the answer was simple and clear as spring water. He wanted to work with plants. He wanted to spend his days in greenhouses, hands in the soil, surrounded by growing things. He wanted to teach students about the magic that lived in nature, about the patience required to nurture life, about the quiet satisfaction of watching something flourish under careful attention. He wanted to be where he had always been happiest, where he had always felt most himself. Professor Sprout, hearing of his decision, was delighted. She had been considering retirement for some time. The war had aged her, and she longed to spend her remaining years in her own garden, tending roses and enjoying the peace. She offered to take Neville on as her apprentice, to teach him everything she knew about magical plants and their properties, to prepare him to one day take over the herbology position at Hogwarts. And so, Neville's path revealed itself, dear listener, not as a grand destiny or a dramatic calling, but as a gentle homecoming to the place where he had always belonged. He spent 2 years studying under Professor Sprout, learning advanced herbology techniques, traveling to magical gardens and greenhouses around the world, discovering rare specimens and ancient cultivation methods. He visited dragon reserves in Romania to study fire-resistant plants. He explored the rainforests of South America, where magical and mundane vegetation intertwined in impossible ways. He spent months in the Forbidden Forest, cataloguing the magical flora that thrived in the shadow of Hogwarts. And through it all, he remained himself, kind, humble, endlessly patient with growing things and with people. The fame that had been thrust upon him began to fade as the wizarding world moved forward, rebuilding itself, and Neville was grateful for the return to relative anonymity. During those years of study and travel, Neville also found love in an unexpected place. Hannah Abbott had been a Hufflepuff in his year at Hogwarts, a kind girl with blonde pigtails who had always been friendly to him, even in the early years when he'd been hopelessly clumsy and anxious. They'd lost touch after school ended, but when Neville returned to England from one of his research trips, he stopped at the Leaky Cauldron for a meal and discovered that Hannah was now working there, having taken over as landlady from old Tom. They began talking, and the conversation flowed easily, comfortably. Hannah understood what it was like to have lost someone in the war. Her mother had been killed by Death Eaters in their 6th year. She understood the peculiar burden of being known for one terrible or wonderful moment while trying to build a normal life. She was warm and practical and grounded, with a gentle humor that made Neville laugh and a kindness that reminded him of the best parts of Hogwarts. They began seeing each other regularly, walks around London, quiet dinners at the Leaky Cauldron after closing time, trips to magical gardens where Neville would enthusiastically explain the properties of various plants while Hannah listened with genuine interest. Their relationship grew slowly, naturally, like a well-tended plant reaching towards sunlight. They married on a warm spring day, surrounded by friends and family and what seemed like every magical plant in Britain, all arranged by Neville in cascading displays of colour and life. Luna was there, of course, wearing a dress covered in what she insisted were invisible nifflers. Ginny and Harry attended with their young son James. Ron and Hermione came, their daughter Rose clutching a bouquet of enchanted flowers. Even Professor McGonagall, now head mistress of Hogwarts, took time from her duties to witness the union. Augusta Longbottom sat in the front row, her vulture-topped hat replaced for the occasion with something slightly less formidable, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she watched her grandson marry a woman who clearly adored him. And Neville, standing at the altar with Hannah's hands in his, felt a completeness he had never quite experienced before, the sense that all the broken pieces of his life had somehow arranged themselves into something beautiful and whole. When Professor Sprout finally retired, Neville stepped into the role of herbology professor at Hogwarts with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that his students would have found endearingly familiar. At 30 years old, he returned to the castle that had been his home, his refuge, his testing ground. This time, not as a struggling student, but as a teacher with knowledge to share and patience to give. His first day teaching was both terrifying and wonderful, dear listener. He stood before a classroom of first years, children whose faces reflected the same anxiety he'd felt at their age, and saw himself in every uncertain expression, every fidgeting hand. He understood what it felt like to be scared of failing, to worry that you weren't good enough, to believe that everyone else was naturally talented while you had to struggle for every small victory. I know some of you are nervous, he told that first class, his voice gentle and warm. I was nervous too when I started at Hogwarts. I was terrible at most magic. I melted 6 cauldrons in potions. I couldn't remember passwords. I lost my toad constantly. But you know what? I was good at herbology. And that one thing I was good at taught me something important. Everyone has gifts. Everyone has something they can excel at if they're patient enough to find it and determined enough to nurture it. He showed them how to handle bouncing bulbs at that first lesson. And when one boy, a round-faced Hufflepuff, who reminded Neville achingly of his younger self, accidentally dropped his bulb and it bounced wildly around the greenhouse, Neville simply smiled and helped him retrieve it. "It's all right," he said quietly. "Plants are forgiving. They give you chances to try again. That's one of the beautiful things about working with growing things. There's always another season, always another opportunity to get it right." Over the years, Neville became beloved at Hogwarts in a way that was quieter than Dumbledore's legend or McGonagall's stern respect, but no less profound. Students knew that Professor Longbottom's greenhouse was a safe place, somewhere you could struggle without judgment, somewhere mistakes were treated as learning opportunities, somewhere kindness was valued as highly as knowledge. He had a particular gift for reaching students who felt they didn't belong, who struggled with magic, who believed they were somehow less than their peers. He would work with them patiently, finding the thing they were good at, nurturing their confidence the way he nurtured his plants, with careful attention, gentle encouragement, and absolute faith that growth would come in its own time. His marriage to Hannah flourished as well. They split their time between Hogwarts during term and the leaky cauldron during holidays, creating a life that balanced Neville's love of teaching and plants with Hannah's talent for hospitality and creating welcoming spaces. They never had children of their own, but they didn't need to. Neville had hundreds of students over the years, each one receiving his patient attention and care, while Hannah mothered every lonely traveller who passed through the leaky cauldron. Neville continued to visit his parents at St. Mungo's, faithful as the turning of seasons. Even though they could never know what he had accomplished, could never understand that their son had helped save the wizarding world, he would sit with them and talk about his life, about his students, about the plants he was cultivating. His mother would still sometimes press crumpled sweet wrappers into his hand, and he would still accept them with the same gentle gratitude, treasuring these small gestures as the only gifts she could give. "I did it, Mum," he told her once, holding her vacant hand in his. "I stood up to them, to Bellatrix, to Voldemort, to all of it. I was brave, like you and Dad. I hope, wherever you are in there, you're proud." Alice Longbottom stared at nothing, her eyes unfocused, but Neville thought, or perhaps simply hoped, that somewhere deep inside, in whatever fragment of herself remained intact, she understood and was pleased. The years passed gently, dear listener, marked by the rhythms of the school year and the changing seasons in the greenhouse. Neville's hair began to grey at the temples. His face gained lines from smiling. His hands, constantly working in soil, became permanently stained with earth and plant matter. But his essential nature remained unchanged. He was still kind, still patient, still prone to occasional forgetfulness, though now it was his reading glasses he misplaced rather than Trevor. Students who passed through his classes carried his lessons with them into the world. Some became herbologists themselves, inspired by his passion and knowledge. Others simply remembered that there had been a teacher who saw value in them when they couldn't see it in themselves, who taught them that courage could be quiet and strength could be gentle, that the most important magic often had nothing to do with spells and everything to do with care. The portrait that eventually hung in the Hogwarts corridors, for all professors of note were granted this honor, showed Neville in his greenhouse, surrounded by plants in various stages of bloom, his round face peaceful and content. When students would pass by and address the portrait, asking questions about herbology or simply seeking encouragement, Portrait Neville would smile and offer the same patient wisdom that Living Neville had shared with his classes. "Remember," he would say, "growth takes time. Be patient with yourself. Be kind. Keep trying, even when it's hard. You're stronger than you know." The legend of the boy who pulled the sword of Gryffindor from a burning hat, who destroyed Voldemort's final Horcrux, who led the resistance during Hogwarts' darkest year. That legend lived on in textbooks and stories told to wide-eyed children. But the reality of Neville Longbottom was somehow even better than the legend. A man who had chosen kindness over bitterness, teaching over glory, plants over power. He had been the boy who almost was, almost the chosen one, almost overlooked entirely, almost forgotten by history. Instead, he had become exactly who he needed to be. A reminder that heroes come in unexpected forms, that courage can bloom in the quietest hearts, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to give up. In the greenhouse at Hogwarts, tended by Professor Longbottom's careful hands, plants grew that couldn't be found anywhere else in Britain. Rare specimens collected from his travels. Experimental hybrids he'd developed through years of patient cultivation. Healing herbs he grew specifically for the hospital wing. And among them all, in a place of honor, grew a Mimblus Mimbletonia. Not the one from his student days, but a descendant of it, still producing stink sap when provoked, still ugly and wonderful and absolutely perfect. Sometimes, late at night, when the castle slept and moonlight streamed through the greenhouse glass, Neville would walk among his plants, touching leaves gently, checking soil moisture, whispering encouragement to seedlings struggling to break through the earth. And in those quiet moments, he would think about the journey that had brought him here. From a terrified first year who couldn't make a feather levitate, to a man who had stared down the darkest wizard in history and struck the blow that made his defeat possible. He thought about his parents, forever lost in the fog of their broken minds, but never forgotten. their courage living on in him. He thought about Luna's dreamy wisdom, Ginny's fierce loyalty, Harry's unexpected friendship. He thought about his grandmother, who had pushed him to be strong, and then learned to accept the particular kind of strength he possessed. He thought about Hannah, sleeping peacefully in their quarters, her warmth waiting for him when he finished his nightly rounds. And he thought about all the students who would pass through his greenhouse in years to come, all the young people who would need to learn that their worth wasn't measured by natural talent or immediate success, but by persistence and kindness and the courage to keep growing even when growth was painful. The story of Neville Longbottom, dear listener, is not a tale of destiny fulfilled or prophecy realized. It is something quieter and perhaps more powerful. The story of a boy who chose again and again to be brave when bravery was required, who chose kindness when cruelty would have been easier, who chose to nurture life even in the shadow of death. It is a story that whispers through the corridors of Hogwarts still, carried in the rustle of plant leaves and the encouragement of portraits, in the memory of a sword pulled from fire and a snake struck down at the crucial moment. It is a story that says, you don't have to be chosen to be important. You don't have to be naturally gifted to make a difference. You simply have to refuse to give up. And isn't that, after all, the most magical thing of all? Ending. Rest now, dear listener. And so we come to the end of our journey through the life of Neville Longbottom, dear listener. From a boy born into prophecy's shadow to a man who created his own legacy. From trembling hands that could barely hold a wand to steady hands that tended life with infinite patience. From fear to courage, from doubt to certainty, from darkness into light. Let the story settle now, like seeds finding their place in fertile soil. Let Neville's journey remind you that growth is rarely dramatic. It happens slowly, steadily, one small choice at a time. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That kindness is its own form of magic, and patience is its own form of power. Picture, if you will, the greenhouses at Hogwarts on a peaceful summer evening. The light is golden and warm, streaming through glass panels. Plants of every description grow in careful abundance, some flowering, some fruiting, some simply stretching their leaves toward the sun. The air smells of earth and growth and possibility. And there, moving among the plants with gentle certainty, is Professor Longbottom. His hair is silver now, his face lined with years of smiling, his hands stained with soil, move with the practiced ease of someone who has spent a lifetime nurturing growth. He hums softly to himself as he works, occasionally pausing to speak words of encouragement to a struggling seedling. The castle beyond the greenhouse is peaceful. Students are gone for the summer, but their presence lingers in the very stones. All the young people who have learned and grown within these walls, all the lives that have been shaped by the magic that happens here, and among them, hundreds who passed through Neville's greenhouse and learned that they were stronger than they knew, braver than they believed, more capable than they imagined. The sun sets slowly over Hogwarts, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold and deepening blue. Stars begin to emerge, the same stars that have watched over the castle for 1,000 years, that witnessed its founding and its battles, its triumphs and its sorrows, its endless cycle of students arriving frightened and leaving transformed. And in the greenhouse, Neville finishes his evening rounds, satisfied that all his plants are thriving, all his careful work is bearing fruit. He extinguishes the lanterns with a wave of his wand. Still not his father's wand, which was destroyed long ago, but one that chose him properly, that fits his magic perfectly. He steps out into the summer evening, locks the greenhouse door, and walks back toward the castle, toward Hannah, toward home. Somewhere in St. Mungo's hospital, his parents sleep the restless sleep of those whose minds were broken too badly to heal. But their son carries their courage forward, transformed into something uniquely his own. Not the dramatic bravery of auras facing dark wizards, but the quiet courage of a teacher who believes in every student, who refuses to give up on anyone, who knows that with patience and care, even the most unlikely seedling can bloom. Rest now, dear listener. Let sleep come gently, naturally, like nightfall over a peaceful garden. You have walked with Neville through his journey from uncertainty to triumph, from fear to courage, from being overlooked to being exactly where he needed to be. Remember his story when you face your own challenges. Remember that growth takes time, that courage can be quiet, that the most important victories often happen in small moments rather than grand gestures. Remember that you are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and capable of extraordinary things if you simply refuse to give up. The greenhouse at Hogwarts will be there tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. The plants will continue to grow. Students will continue to learn. And the legacy of a round-faced boy who became a hero will continue to inspire all who hear his tale. Sleep well, dear listener. Sleep deeply and peacefully, wrapped in the knowledge that courage lives in unexpected places, that heroes come in gentle forms, and that sometimes the most magical thing in the world is simply the determination to keep growing, no matter what. The story is complete. The journey is finished. Rest comes now, sweet and well-earned. Good night.